It was raining heavily that night. I remember clearly, it was December 12th. A normal day suddenly turned into a nightmare. After being held back by the teacher for bad grades, I left school quietly. All my friends had gone home, leaving me alone in the cold rain and dark streets. Although I didn't want to admit it, a strange feeling crept into my mind as I stepped out of the school gate. The rain was pouring down, the street lamps casting a weak light through the rainwater, distorting the scene. I kept my head down and walked, trying to ignore the feeling of someone's eyes watching me. But it doesn't go away. I couldn't resist. I looked back, hoping to see a friend who was teasing me, or even a stranger. But there was no one. Just a strange, blurry figure standing about 10 to 15 meters away from me. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized that this was no ordinary person. The woman was unusually tall, at least 8 feet tall, with an unnaturally thin body. Her face almost took my breath away, horribly disfigured, with dozens of tiny eyes clustered in a dense mass of ashen skin, each staring at me. Her arms reached down to her knees, dangling motionlessly at her sides. Her jaw hung limply, as if it would fall off at any moment. I couldn't look away. Horror froze me. But then she crouched down, got on all fours like an animal, and began to lunge at me. I screamed and turned to run. My heart was pounding, the rain was hitting my face, but I didn't dare look back. Her footsteps echoed in my head, rapid and heavy. When I got home, I slammed the door and tried to breathe, but the air felt thick. I couldn't sleep that night. The sound of rain falling outside the window mingled with the pounding of my heart in my chest. I told myself it was just my imagination. Perhaps the darkness, the rain, and the stress were making things happen. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next day, I decided to take a different route home, trying to stay away from where I had seen her. But as I rounded the corner, I felt her presence again. This time, she was standing right under a streetlight, just a few meters away from me. The air was frozen. I didn't dare look at her for long, quickly turning around and running, but I could feel her eyes following my every step. Every day, she appeared again, always at the same distance, always in my line of sight. But there was one thing I noticed. She only moved when I looked at her. Every time I turned around, she moved closer, inch by inch, like a cruel, never-ending game. I tried to ignore her, but even with my eyes closed, I could feel her presence. Her heavy breathing seemed to echo right next to my ear. I didn't dare tell anyone, afraid they would think I was crazy. Day by day, the fear grew, until it consumed me completely. On December 26th, she was no longer standing far away. As I entered the house, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I did not dare to turn around, but I knew she was right behind me. I rushed into my room, locked the door, and turned on my computer. I wrote these words, hoping that writing them down would help me keep my mind steady. But as I typed each word, I could feel her getting closer. Her heavy breathing was audible, and I knew she was standing right behind me. I didn't dare look, but something was pulling me, an invisible force that forced me to turn. My hands were shaking, numb. I didn't want to, but I knew I couldn't resist. If I look at her, I will lose everything. I can't explain why, but the moment I turned around, I knew I wouldn't be myself anymore. Something would take me, choke me from the inside, the way darkness takes light. Her breath was so cold and close that I felt my skin freeze. My hands remained motionless on the keyboard. The clicking of her fingers faded, leaving only the sound of her heavy breathing in the silence. I felt as if those eyes, dozens of misshapen eyes, were piercing my back, slowly sucking out my soul. I fought against the strange pull. "Don't look." I repeated it over and over in my head like a mantra. But the harder I tried, the more I felt my body betray my will. My head shook, my neck stiffened, but it was as if an invisible force was forcing me back. I closed my eyes, hoping that would save me. But then a whisper came, small but clear. Her voice, hoarse, cold, but somehow like my own. Look, just a look. I couldn't resist. An invisible force pulled me back. When I opened my eyes, I saw her. Her full horror was revealed to me. Her twisted face, her dozens of glowing eyes, and her hanging jaw that made clicking sounds like laughter. Her arms reached out and grabbed me before I could scream. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, I was standing on that rainy street, right where I had first met her. But nothing was the same. My body felt different, cold, heavy, and not mine anymore. I tried to look at my hands, but they wouldn't obey me. In a nearby window, I saw my reflection. But it wasn't me. What I saw was her, tall, twisted, her face full of eyes. I realized I had become her, and the real me had been pulled somewhere I could never return to. And now, here I stand, waiting for the next one to turn around and look at me. I moved to Hartfield after James died. A small, quiet town, nestled among the fields and woods of the American Midwest. It seemed like the perfect place to get away from it all. My new apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building, where the hallways were cold and the ceiling lights flickered. But it was quiet, and I figured I needed that. James died just weeks before our wedding. He was in a car accident on his way to see me, with the promise that he would be home soon. Memories of him still haunt me. His deep voice, the way he smiled when he talked about our future. I still wear my engagement ring as a reminder that what we had is still there, even when he is gone. To make ends meet, I took a night shift at the Hartfield Connects call center. The work wasn't demanding, answering calls about bills, broken electronics, and other small issues that customers didn't want to wait until morning. The nights were usually quiet, save for the tapping of keyboards and the humming of fluorescent lights overhead. But since I started working here, I've heard strange stories from my coworkers. Line 3, the phone in the corner of the office, is said to bring bad luck. No one says why, but there are rumors of calls at 3:03 a.m., always at the same time, always from an unknown number. People who answer line 3 leave the job soon after, and Jenny, my predecessor, disappeared completely after taking a call on line 3. I don't believe in superstitions, but I don't want to take any chances. As time passed, I tried to keep my distance from line 3, until the night everything changed. The clock on my desk read 3:03 a.m. when the light on line 3 started blinking. I didn't mean to answer, but somehow my hand kept reaching for the phone. It was a strange feeling, like something was pulling me closer. When I picked up the phone, a cold air rushed over me. At first, there was just a crackling sound, like radio static. Then the whispers began. They were soft but uneasy, as if coming from far away. I couldn't make out what they were, but there was something familiar about the voice, like I'd heard it before. The air around me grew heavy, and I caught a strange scent, withered roses, mixed with the smell of burning. Voices grew clearer, and I heard words I never thought I'd hear again. My love. Forever. It was James. I couldn't believe it, but deep down I knew it was him. His voice was soft but pained, as if dragging each word from a very far away place. I wanted to say something, but my throat was tight. My hands were shaking as I gripped the receiver. Suddenly, another sound interrupted, strong, deep, as if coming from underground. The sound chilled me to the bone. It said only one word, enough. At that moment, the line went dead. I sat there silently, my heart pounding like it was going to explode. When I turned around, I saw Marcus, my supervisor, standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes filled with worry. On his wrists, I noticed circular, scorched scars, like they had been eaten away by something hot. I couldn't explain what had happened, but deep down, I knew it was just beginning. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about James's voice. It wasn't just my imagination. It felt so real, so close, like he was right there on the other end of the line, but separated by something dark and impassable. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with questions about what had happened. Marcus, my supervisor, kept his distance, but I couldn't help but notice the way he stared at line 3 every time it flashed, his eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. The scars on his wrists haunted me. They weren't like ordinary burns, perfect circles, as if they had been carved by flaming rings. One night, I mustered up the courage to ask him about the scars. He didn't answer right away, his eyes flickering to line 3 as it lit up again at 3:03 a.m. Finally, he said in a low, heavy voice, "You shouldn't have answered that call." He didn't elaborate, but I saw regret and fear flashing in his eyes. I tried to concentrate on my work, but everything seemed to have changed since that night. Tiny whispers, like wind coming through the window, began to appear in the office at night. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling flickered irregularly, creating distorted shadows that danced on the walls. And the familiar scent of wilted roses, mixed with the smell of burning, seemed to follow me whenever I approached line 3. I decided to find out more about line 3. Digging through old office files, I discovered that the center had been part of an old call center system that connected several neighboring suburbs. But there was something strange. Every record of line 3 had been erased, as if it had never existed. I found a news item from a few years ago about a center employee who had disappeared after a midnight call. Jenny Thompson, as she was called, was the last person to answer line 3 before disappearing without a trace. Things began to make sense when I overheard Marcus talking to a former colleague. He mentioned St. Augustine Church, an abandoned place on the edge of town that was once popular for wedding ceremonies, but had been closed after a series of mysterious disappearances decades ago. The name made me feel uneasy, like it stirred a distant memory I couldn't quite place. Part of me wanted to ignore it all, but James's voice kept ringing in my head. His love. Forever. There was something about it that couldn't be ignored, a cry for help that I couldn't ignore. I decided to investigate. The next night, when line 3 blinked, I didn't pick up. Instead, I tracked the call through the system. The screen showed a single location, St. Augustine Church. My heart sank when I saw that name again. After work, I drove to the church. The drive there seemed longer than I remembered, even though I had never been there before. Darkness enveloped everything, only the headlights of the cars illuminating the narrow road. The closer we got, the thicker the air became, as if all sound and movement were swallowed up by the darkness. When I arrived, the church loomed like a dark shadow among the towering pines. The main door, heavy and rusted, swung open eerily as I approached. Inside, the air was so cold I could see my breath. The wooden pews were covered in dust, and the flickering light from the candles on the altar made the space look like a damaged oil painting. I can't explain why, but I know I'm not alone. Soft sounds began to echo, like the whispers I had heard over line 3. But this time, they were louder, clearer. They came from the back of the church, where the darkness was thicker and the candles seemed to flicker endlessly. I walked slowly towards it, feeling like hundreds of eyes were watching me from the darkness. As I approached the altar, I saw something that made my blood run cold. An old photograph lay on the altar, covered in ash. It was a wedding photo, a couple holding hands, their faces disfigured beyond recognition. But what made me shudder were the wedding rings on their hands. They were identical to the one I still wore on my finger, the ring James had given me. I couldn't take my eyes off the photo on the altar. The rings in the photo glowed faintly, as if they held a piece of the soul of the person who had worn them. The image made my stomach twist, and a question crept into my mind. Why was my ring so similar? Where had James gotten it? And did he know something I didn't? I turned to leave the church, but the whispers suddenly grew louder, filling the air around me. They were no longer incoherent murmurs, but a haunting chorus, calling my name in unison. Sarah, Sarah. The voice was soft but cold, dragging each syllable like a knife across flesh. I felt a lump in my throat, my hand unconsciously tightening around the engagement ring. The cold was overwhelming, not a physical cold, but a creepy feeling, as if something was crawling on my skin. I tried to step out the door, but the air seemed heavy, preventing any movement. Inside, the darkness was so thick I couldn't tell what was wall and what was shadow. But I knew, somewhere in the darkness, something was watching me. I could feel it in its unseen but penetrating gaze, as if it could see through my thoughts. Soft footsteps echoed from the back of the church, making me freeze. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw a shadow slowly emerging. It was not a clear human shape, but something twisted and twisted as if it had been burned. Each step it took made a slight cracking sound, like hot coals being stepped on. The shape stopped just a few feet away, and I could feel its breath, hot and stifling like ashes. Without words, I knew this was no ordinary spirit. It was not James, nor anyone I had ever known. It was what haunted this church, what bound the poor souls I saw in the photograph. Suddenly, images flashed through my mind, fast and chaotic. Couples stood before this altar, vows spoken in tears and despair. Candles burned brightly as the binding father, the officiant, took their hands and placed flaming rings on them. Their vows were distorted, no longer till death do us part, but even in death, we will be together forever. I saw James in the crowd. His face no longer held the gentleness I had once loved. Instead, he looked at me with burning eyes, his lips whispering a cursed promise. Sarah, his voice echoed in my mind. Not as a sound, but as a thought. Come to me. I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. The love in his voice made my heart clench, but I knew it wasn't true. The James the First knew would never want to bind me to eternal suffering like this. He loved me by setting me free, not by holding me captive. But how can I get out of here? The whispers became more urgent, as if they were urging me to make a decision. I felt the ring on my finger grow warm, like a warning. Suddenly, I remembered Marcus's words. You shouldn't answer. Maybe that was the key. Maybe it all started with this ring. I reached up, my fingers trembling as I touched the engagement ring. It burned as I tried to remove it, but I didn't stop. A thin wisp of smoke rose as my skin burned, but eventually, the ring fell from my finger. Everything was silent. The whispers stopped. The air grew lighter, and the darkness seemed to lift a little. I saw the church doors open, a faint light coming in from outside. I don't know how I managed to move, but I ran. I dashed out of the church, my legs carrying me back to my car. As I sat in the car, panting and shaking, I looked back at the ring lying on the seat beside me. It was no longer glowing, but I knew that didn't mean it was over. Something inside the church was still waiting, still yearning. I couldn't sleep that night. The whispers kept echoing in my head, and I couldn't stop thinking about James. Was he still trapped there? And if so, what could I do to free him? I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the church. Every image flashed through my mind, every whisper, every step on the cold stone floor. But what haunted me most was James's eyes. They were not the gentle eyes I had loved, but the eyes of an imprisoned soul, yearning for freedom but bound by an unbreakable oath. I spent the next day researching St. Augustine. Information about the place was scant, mostly vague, and filled with bizarre rumors. The church had been abandoned 3 decades earlier, after a series of mysterious disappearances. All were newlyweds who had disappeared just days after attending a wedding ceremony at the church. No bodies were ever found, leaving behind charred wedding rings and the words scrawled in blood on the altar. Forever. Never parted. Old news clippings also mention Father Michael, who was once the head priest of the church. He was known for his inspiring sermons on love and devotion, But after the disappearances, he too disappeared. Some say he went into hiding, while others believe he committed suicide out of guilt. But now I know the truth. He didn't disappear. He became part of the church, an entity that held damned souls. I tried to contact Marcus. He was the only one who knew what was going on, but he didn't answer. I went to his office, but it was empty, except for a note on the desk. I warned you. Don't come back. But I couldn't stop. I needed to know more, needed to understand what was happening. I decided to go back to the church at night. This time, I brought a flashlight, a shaker of salt, and an old book I found in the library about exorcisms and curse breaking. I didn't know if these would work, but I had no other choice. When I entered the church, the air was colder than before. The shadows seemed thicker, enveloping everything. I headed straight for the altar, where the old photograph still lay, but this time it had changed. The faces of the couples in the photo were clearer, and I recognized them. They were the missing people I had read about, Jenny Thompson, the newlyweds, and Marcus. They were all there, staring at me through the photo with empty, pained eyes. The whispers began again, but this time, they weren't just in my head. They echoed throughout the space, as if the stone walls were whispering at once. I couldn't make out the words, but one phrase echoed over and over. We can't be apart. We can't be apart. I placed my engagement ring on the altar, and instantly, the air felt torn apart. Different images flashed before my eyes. James and I at our happiest, then all turned to dust. I saw him standing before Father Michael, his hand shaking as he placed the wedding ring on my finger. His vows echoed in the air. Forever, even in death. I understood. It was James, whether he intended or not, who had bound us to this curse. Suddenly, a voice came from behind me, deep and majestic, but filled with despair. It was Father Michael, or at least what he had become. He stood in the shadows, his robes tattered as if blown by the wind, and his eyes burned like fire. "Love cannot be broken," he said, his voice echoing from the depths. "Don't you understand that what I did was to protect them? To keep their love alive forever?" I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "Love is not a cage," I whispered. "And it is not pain." He did not answer, but his eyes seemed to soften for a moment. Then the darkness enveloped him again, and the fire in his eyes burned more fiercely. I knew I didn't have much time. I opened the old book and began to read the blurred lines. The words came out of my mouth, shaky but determined. I sprinkled salt in circles around the altar, feeling the air vibrate with each word I spoke. The images of James, of Marcus, and of all the people imprisoned in this church became clearer, as if they were watching me, hoping for something. But then the fire flared, and Father Michael rushed toward me, the shadows around him turning into 1,000 arms trying to pull me into nothingness. I struggled to stay calm as darkness wrapped around me, shadowy arms pulling me away from the salt circle. The air felt thick, as if I were sinking into a nightmare with no way out. Father Michael's voice echoed in my head, no longer sad but now sharp and angry. "You think you can break what I have created? Eternal love is the only gift I can give." I knew I couldn't let him get to me. This curse wasn't just about James or me. It was about everyone who had been bound here. They were souls trapped in a vicious cycle, unable to find peace. I couldn't let that continue. My hands trembled as I flipped through the old books, searching for the words of release. Finally, I found a ritual I had never dared to imagine. A ritual that required sacrifice, not of blood, but of free will. The practitioner had to give up all ties, all memories, to free the trapped souls. My heart aches at the thought. James, our memories, all gone, as if they never existed. But I know I have no choice. True love isn't about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go. As I began to recite the rite, Father Michael roared. His rage was like a storm. The darkness surrounding me grew stronger. Flames erupted from the altar, but I did not stop. The words came from my mouth stronger, more determined. Bound souls, hear me. With my free will, I break this curse. Love is not eternal, but voluntary. All that is imprisoned, return to the light. The room shook violently. The stone walls cracked, and I could hear screams, not of pain, but of relief. The images of the couples in the photos faded, their faces changing from pain to peace. Their hands fell apart, their burning rings falling to the floor and turning to ash. I felt a strange strength in my heart, as if I was touching something bigger than myself. But I also knew that with every word I read, a part of me was disappearing. The memory of James, of his smile, of the way he whispered my name on peaceful nights, all faded like smoke. As I read the last word, there was a loud bang, and I was thrown from the altar. I lay motionless on the floor, breathing heavily, my body aching. The darkness was gone, and the dim light of dawn filtered through the broken windows. The church was empty, silent. There was no sign of Father Michael, no more trapped souls. Just me alone. I stood up and walked slowly out of the church. I had no memory of why I was there, or what I had done. A vague sense of loss washed over me, but I couldn't pinpoint the reason. The engagement ring was gone, and I had no memory of who had given it to me. As I stepped into the morning light, I knew it was over. But my heart felt empty, as if a part of me had been taken away forever. Maybe I had sacrificed too much. Maybe I had lost something I could never get back. But deep in my mind, a soft voice spoke, like a whisper on the wind. "Thank you, Sarah." I didn't know where that voice came from, but it brought me a little peace. I turned my back on the church, leaving it behind forever. The whispers stopped. But sometimes, in my dreams, I still hear the church bells ringing, echoing from far away. And I wonder, are they really free? Or am I just the next in a never-ending story? My name is Elias, and I live in an old apartment in a rundown neighborhood in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. My apartment is small, the walls are stained with time and have an indelible musty smell. My life is unremarkable. Day after day, I just go to work, come home, and try not to pay too much attention to the world around me. That morning, I woke up with a feeling that something was wrong. My chest felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. The air in the room was stuffy. The familiar musty smell seemed heavier. I looked around, the dim morning light filtering through the curtains, creating blurry shadows on the walls. Everything seemed normal, but something inside me was changing. I tried to shake it off and started my day. On my way down the stairs, I saw Greta, an elderly neighbor, struggling to pull up a grocery cart. She was frail and slow, her wrinkled face glistening with sweat. A strange impulse drove me. I didn't want to stop, but my legs seemed to be in control. I stepped forward and offered to help. As I pulled the heavy cart up the rickety wooden steps, Greta smiled gratefully, revealing her loose dentures. "Thank you, Elias." "God bless you," she said as I parked the cart at her apartment door. I nodded reluctantly and turned away. At that moment, a sneer came from the street below. I glanced down and saw a young man leaning against a lamppost, looking at me with a mocking gaze. Although he said nothing, I could feel the contempt. Everything seemed to freeze for a moment. I walked faster, but my chest burned, feeling as if invisible whispers were surrounding me. That evening, I returned to my apartment to find my mailbox full of paperwork. A letter from the building management accusing me of damaging the plumbing. Another notice from the city, warning me about suspicious behavior reported by neighbors. I stood motionless in the dark hallway, feeling as if the air around me was suffocating me. I went back to my apartment, closed the door, and sat down on the couch. The whispers came again, but this time, they weren't just random echoes. They had form, accusations, taunts, the contemptuous laughter of people who never saw me as I was. I don't know what's going on. All I want is to help. But it seems like whatever I do comes back against me. In the days that followed, I tried to avoid people. It seemed that every time I interfered with someone's life, things got worse. I started walking to work, even though the streets of Rotterdam were full of uneven cobblestones that made my legs ache. I didn't want to get on the bus, didn't want to see anyone, didn't want my presence to add to the chaos of the world around me. At the office, I kept my head down and my hands busy answering emails. But no matter how hard I tried to be quiet, the unease still clung to me. That whisper never went away. It seemed to be ingrained in every corner of my mind, emanating from an unidentifiable source. One day, I heard Nina, my coworker in accounting, sighing as she stood in front of the broken coffee maker. She was fiddling with the old machine, trying to tap it gently in hopes of getting the last drops of coffee out. I sat at my desk, my hand tightening on the mouse as I felt the familiar urge. A voice in my head spoke urgently, not my own but strangely familiar. Help her. I tried to ignore it, but my body wouldn't listen. I found myself standing up, walking toward Nina. Before I knew it, I was offering to help. Nina smiled and thanked me gratefully. For half an hour, I fumbled with the coffee maker, rewiring the old wires, while the whispers in my head grew louder, as if mocking me. When the coffee maker finally worked, I felt relieved. But the relief didn't last long. At lunchtime, the manager called me into his office. Mr. Clark looked at me over his glasses, his tone both disappointed and stern. We received a complaint, he said. Nina said you kept hovering around her and being annoying. I sat there, stunned, my mind spinning. I'm just trying to fix the coffee maker, I stammered. Zach, this isn't the first time. Other coworkers have found you acting odd. Maybe you need some time off. He tapped his pen against the table, his eyes implying something I couldn't resist. I staggered out of the office, the whispers in my head growing louder, screaming frantic. I felt something alive inside me, not the familiar feeling of self-recrimination, but something different, like I was no longer in control. I got home late that night. It was raining, and the cobblestones were slippery underfoot. As I turned into an alley, I saw a figure lying motionless on the ground. It was a man, his face pale, clutching his chest as if in excruciating pain. I wanted to leave. Every sense in me screamed at me not to interfere. But my feet moved forward, as if driven by some outside force. I bent down, trying to shake the man awake. He groaned weakly, his eyes glazed with pain. I picked up the phone and called an ambulance. When the ambulance arrived, I breathed a sigh of relief. But then I heard a sharp voice from the crowd. Where is his wallet? I turned around and saw a woman pointing at me. She confirmed that she had seen me rummaging through the man's pockets. Suspicious eyes were on me, the whispers in my head mixed with the murmurs of the crowd. I tried to explain, but no one listened. When the police showed up, I didn't wait any longer. I ran, leaving everything behind. I rushed back to my apartment, locked the door, and sat on the cold floor. My body trembled, and the whispers were no longer just echoes in my head. They had become a living presence, seeping through every fiber of my being, every breath I took. I could feel them curling up in my chest, like a parasite growing larger and larger. I stared into the bathroom mirror, but the reflection didn't seem to be mine anymore. My eyes, no longer just human eyes, flashed with an eerie light, as if something else was looking back at me. I don't know what's real anymore. I just know that this thing, whatever it is eating me from the inside. I locked myself in my apartment, determined not to go out. I quit my job, cut off all contact. Food ran out, but I didn't care. The whispers in my head became a symphony of sarcasm, anger, and sometimes sweet persuasion. They told me to leave, to get out of this room, to face everything. But I couldn't. I no longer trusted the outside world, and worse, I no longer trusted myself. At night, the apartment became a trap. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel movement in my chest. A creature, or rather a consciousness, was writhing inside me, seemingly waiting for me to exhaust myself so it could take over. I could hear footsteps in the hallway, the sound of cars on the street below, but they were all faint, as if I were separated by an invisible wall. I began to suspect that I was being followed. Every time I looked out the window, I saw silhouettes standing under the streetlights. They were motionless, their faces were unclear, but I knew they were looking at me. At times, I was sure I could hear their whispers, mingling with the voices in my head. But every time I turned and looked back, they were gone. One night, I decided to find answers. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the urge of the creature inside. I pulled a knife from the kitchen, determined to touch the thing that was haunting me. I pulled up my shirt, revealing my chest covered in cold sweat. The blade trembled against my skin, but before I could press down, a sharp pain erupted. I collapsed to the floor, feeling like I was on fire from within. Then I saw it, not in a mirror or in my imagination. It was there for a fleeting moment as I looked down at my chest. A dark shape, its tendrils soft and powerful, undulating like waves. It had no eyes, but I felt it watching me, knowing every corner of my mind. It was a parasite, but it was also part of me. "You know who I am," the voice said in my head, clearly for the first time. It wasn't angry or threatening, but like an old friend, frighteningly familiar. I did not answer. I did not dare. "I am not an invader," it continued. "I am your creation. You created me." I couldn't deny it. Buried emotions, failure, fear, twisted compassion, rose in a tidal wave. It was everything I hated about myself, the embodiment of my powerlessness and need for control. It had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for my weakest moment. From that day on, things got weirder. The lights in the apartment started flickering for no apparent reason. The water in the bathtub turned a pale red, and a strong metallic smell filled my nostrils, making me nauseous. Mirrors in the house, from the bathroom to the small mirror I kept in my pocket, began reflecting things they shouldn't have. Shadows moving behind me, hands pressing hard against the glass from the other side. One time, I tried to open my phone camera to record what was happening. But when I played back the video, everything was blurry and full of grain. Then, in the middle of the video, the image became clear for a moment. A figure standing behind me, tall and still, no face. I threw the phone away, my whole body shaking. The dreams became more vivid. I dreamed I was running through a forest, branches scratching at my skin, whispers turning to screams. I didn't know what I was running from, but I knew that if I stopped, it would end. One day, I woke up with dirt in my hands and mud on my shoes. Where had I gone? Or was it all part of a nightmare? The apartment became more and more like a cage. I didn't know if I was imprisoned by the outside world or by my own mind. The walls seemed to be getting narrower, the darkness spreading from the corners like a living entity. I could no longer distinguish between day and night. The last night, I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers had become a mad song now, a constant refrain in my head. I stood in the middle of the room, the light from the single bulb casting strange shapes on the walls. The creature inside me had risen, taken over completely. I felt it move, no longer hidden. Dark tendrils crawled across my skin, reaching out as if to claim ownership. I screamed, but no one heard. In the final moment before everything fell apart, I saw my reflection in the cracked mirror. It was no longer me. Those eyes were no longer human. That face was no longer human. It was the creature. It was me. It was everything I had tried to hide. When I woke up, it wasn't as dark as the night before, but the apartment had changed. The warped sense of reality made everything hazy. The walls seemed higher, the hallways longer, and the corners darker than they should have been. My body was cold, and my veins felt as if they were being squeezed by invisible strings. But the scariest thing was that I didn't feel quite myself anymore. Everything inside me was now split. Part of me was still me, a trembling entity in fear. But the other, larger part was the creature. It was no longer a whisper, but a presence, not just in my mind, but in my body. The stabbing pains in my chest seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat, each beat carrying a sense of possession. I decided to find the truth. There was no other choice. Either I faced it, or it would consume me completely. I found strange traces in the apartment. Scribbles on the walls that I didn't remember writing, pages torn from an old notebook filled with strange symbols. On the table, my small mirror was neatly placed, and next to it was a clock. But the hands of the clock weren't moving. Instead, they pointed to a single number, 3:33. This time seemed familiar. I don't know why, but it felt harsh and uncomfortable, like a warning. I picked up the mirror and stared at my reflection. The face in the mirror didn't move, but the eyes moved, looking straight at me. A voice rang out, deep and cold. "We are one. You will never escape." I flinched and threw the mirror to the floor. The sound of the break echoed through the room like a bell, and for a moment, I felt like I was somewhere else. No longer the apartment, but a strange space, filled with shadows crawling on the walls and hallways that seemed to have no end. I looked back at the journals scattered across my desk, trying to piece together the clues. In the scraggly lines, I realized I had written about these nightmares. A dark creature, a constant presence with me since I was a child. It was not some nameless parasite. It was a part of me, always there, always waiting to take control. The words gradually became clearer. Its name appeared over and over, Umbra. I recalled fragments of forgotten memories. Times I'd seen my shadow move when I wasn't moving, dreams of a creature reaching out from the darkness. The Umbra wasn't an outside invader. It was a darkness inside me, born of fear, failure, and regret. As the clock struck 3:33 a.m., everything in the apartment stopped. There was no sound, no movement. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling a chill run down my spine. Then, from the dark corners, Umbra appeared. It had no clear shape, just a mass of black shadow, undulating and shifting. But its eyes, they were a copy of mine, full of mockery and menace. It stepped closer, each step shaking the air around it. "You cannot hide forever," its voice echoed in my head. "I am you. I am what you fear." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Umbra stopped right in front of me, and I realized there was no more running away. If I didn't face it, it would take me over completely. "What do you want?" I managed to say, though my voice was weak. Umbra didn't answer. It just reached out a tendril and touched my chest. A sharp pain spread, but not from the outside, but from within. It was mining my memory, digging up all the pain and failure I had buried. In a moment, I saw everything. The mistakes, the fears, the times I felt inadequate. It all flashed before me like a movie, but instead of feeling scared, I realized that this was the heart of it. Umbra was not the enemy. It was the embodiment of what I had been trying to bury. I took a deep breath, trying to focus. If it was a part of me, then maybe I could control it. But how? The pain was getting worse, and Umbra was invading my mind more and more. Then a thought occurred to me. I needed to accept it, not fight it. If I feared it, I would always be its prisoner. But if I faced it, I could regain control. I didn't know what was coming next, but I closed my eyes, focusing on what I felt. I let it all flow, not pushing it away, not denying it. Umbra began to retreat, bit by bit. But this wasn't a victory. It was still there, in the darkness, waiting. The room returned to normal, but I knew everything had changed. Umbra was not gone, but I was not entirely myself either. We were one now, intertwined and inseparable. As a road patrol officer with over 15 years of experience, I've seen it all: dangerous chases, tragic accidents, and strange, unexplained incidents. But nothing, really nothing, compares to that fateful night in the summer of 2018. It was a normal night, or so I thought. The night shift usually brought a tense silence. I sat in my patrol car, near mile marker 62 on the highway that led into the deep woods. The radio was playing boring code, reporting speeding or minor accidents. Everything was so peaceful that I started to feel bored. Suddenly, the radio emitted an unusual static noise. I frowned and adjusted the frequency, but just then a weak, distorted voice came through the speaker. "Need help. 10 to 90. A chill ran down my spine. The code 10 to 90 was completely foreign to me. It wasn't in the official command list. I tried to contact the dispatch center to confirm, but all I got was a long static, as if the line was jammed. After a moment, my car's GPS screen flickered. A mysterious coordinate appeared, leading to an area deep in the woods, far from any residential areas. I tried calling the supervisor to ask for clarification, but his short reply only made me more confused. "Don't go. Ignore those coordinates. Get back to work." But how could I ignore it? That faint voice kept echoing in my head, like a cry for help from afar. Even though I knew it could be a trap, I decided to investigate. I entered the coordinates into the GPS and drove deep into the darkness. The road into the woods grew narrower. The trees on either side were dense, casting eerie shadows in the headlights. At times, it felt as if the trees were closing in, as if they were trying to swallow my car. The air outside was unnaturally cold, even though it was midsummer. When the GPS told me I had arrived, I stopped the car. All around me was darkness, no light, no sound. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand. Its weak light only shone a few meters before being swallowed by the thick fog. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves rose up, heavy and pressing down on my chest. Then I heard it. A small sound, like a twig snapping, came from up ahead. I shined my flashlight toward the sound, but saw only tall trees. My heart began to beat faster. I called out, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the mist. I took a few more steps, the flashlight beam falling on something lying on the ground. It was an old radio, the kind the police hadn't used in decades. It was humming faintly, and as I bent down to touch it, a piercing scream rang out from inside, making me jump. "Help me!" I stepped back, my hands shaking, my heart pounding. The air around me suddenly became stifling, and I felt an invisible gaze watching me. The flashlight flickered, then suddenly went out, leaving me in complete darkness. Then, from the darkness, whispers began to sound. At first, they were just indistinct murmurs, but gradually, I realized they were voices. They were not one person, but many, blending into a cold harmony. Their voices seemed to penetrate my mind, calling my name, whispering words I could not fully understand. I turned around, trying to find my way back to the car, but the road I had come on had disappeared. The trees seemed to have moved, changed their positions, making everything around me seem stranger and more terrifying than ever. I felt like I was surrounded by shadows, invisible but clearly present entities. As I tried to step back, a cold hand landed on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. My flashlight suddenly turned back on, shining directly on a large stone circle in front of me. Strange characters carved into the stone glowed faintly, giving off an eerie, dim light. In the middle of the circle, a blurry figure appeared. It did not look human, but rather a dense black shadow formed from the surrounding darkness. Its glowing red eyes stared at me, piercing my soul. I could not move, could not scream, just stood there, helpless. The whispering suddenly stopped. Instead, a voice rang out in my head, clear and strong. "You shouldn't have come here. It's late now." The presence of that figure made my entire body feel numb. I tried to scream, but my throat felt choked. The voice in my head kept ringing, getting louder and stronger. It was not just talking to me, it was taking over my mind, overwhelming all thoughts. I don't know how long I stood there. Time seemed to stop. The shadows around me began to move, one by one, circling me like predators. I could feel their cold breath, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Then I saw a figure appear in the middle of the circle of stones. It was a man, his face pale, his eyes vacant. He was wearing a police uniform, but it was torn and covered in dried blood. I recognized him. It was a colleague of mine who had disappeared during a night shift many years ago. No one knew where he had gone, leaving only his empty patrol car by the side of the road. He opened his mouth, but instead of speaking, a thick black smoke poured out. His body trembled, then suddenly disappeared, leaving a scream that echoed throughout the forest. I stepped back, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight. I didn't know what to do, what I could do. But before I could think any further, the voice in my head spoke again, this time angry. "You cannot escape. You belong here." The trees around me began to move, their branches reaching out like monstrous hands, trying to pull me into the darkness. I turned and ran frantically, not knowing where I was running, only knowing that I had to escape this place. But the darkness seemed to follow me. Every step I took was swallowed by it. When I finally saw the lights of my patrol car, I rushed forward, my heart pounding. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove away, not daring to look back. But as soon as I left the woods, I heard one last whisper in my head. "You can leave, but you will never escape us." To this day, I still dream of that forest, those shadows, and that voice every night. And sometimes, when the radio in my house starts to crackle, I know they're still there, waiting for me to come back. I was born and raised in a reserve deep in the forests of Northern Europe, where the tradition of burying the dead is unlike any other. Instead of digging into the ground, we deposit them in a sacred lake, where our ancestors have chosen to entrust their souls for generations. The lake is called the Lake of Souls. The lake lies about 2 miles from the reserve, surrounded by dense forest and moss-covered trees. No one really knows how deep it is, only that it swallows anything that falls into it, dragging it into an endless darkness. The water is pitch black, so cold that you can feel an invisible force as you stand near its edge. Our burial traditions began long before the reservation was established. When a person died, their body was wrapped in moose hair, a symbol of the connection between man and nature, before being placed in the lake. The dead were not simply buried. They were sent to another world, a place where their spirit could reunite with their ancestors. Burials usually take place at night, when the moonlight reflects off the water like a hazy mirror. The sound of hand drums echoes in the darkness, accompanied by ancient songs passed down from generation to generation. We gather around the edge of the lake, watching the bodies of the dead sink slowly into the water, taking their souls with them into the darkness. But the lake is more than just a place of solace. It is alive, as if it has a will of its own. Some elders say that on windy nights they hear whispers from the lake, sounds that are not human. Sometimes they see shadows gliding across the water, as if the spirits of the dead are gathering to welcome the new members. The sounds are not scary, but they give us an eerie feeling, as if the lake is talking to us. As a child, I often accompanied the adults to the lake on ritual occasions. Offerings such as bird feathers, wildflowers, or moose hair were thrown into the water as a prayer to the ancestors. But what haunted me most were the stories the children in the reserve told. At night, if you look into a lake long enough, you will see your own face. But it will not smile back at you. That was a warning from a friend. I didn't believe it until I saw it with my own eyes. One moonlit night, a few friends and I snuck out to the lake. We built a small fire near the water's edge, telling ghost stories to scare each other. But as I stared into the still water, I noticed something was wrong. My reflection didn't move with me. Its eyes seemed to look right through me, not into light but into a deep, dark void. I jumped back, feeling like something beneath the water was pulling me toward it. But when I turned to tell my friends, they were staring down at the lake, their faces pale. That night, we heard drums beating from deep within the lake, even though no one was there to beat them. The sound was urgent, like an inviting knock on the door, and the other children began to cry. We ran home, not daring to look back. From then on, none of us dared to go to the lake at night again. The adults in the reserve often advised us never to disturb the tranquility of the lake. But not everyone listened. A group of young men, curious and arrogant, decided to row out into the middle of the lake to test its depth. They brought along long cables and depth-measuring equipment, believing that this might solve the mystery that had persisted for generations. They never returned. Elders say the spirits of the lake do not forgive such insults. When they went to look for the group, they found only the boat capsized and drifting ashore, the cables stretched to the point of snapping. One man said he heard screams from the lake that night, not human, but an eerie sound that echoed throughout the forest. After that event, strange things began to happen. Whenever the sanctuary held a burial, the water was no longer calm. Instead, it rippled, as if something was stirring from below. Murmurs from the lake became more audible, sometimes uttering the names of the living. One night, while I was sleeping, I felt someone standing at the end of my bed. When I opened my eyes, I saw a blurry figure, covered in moss and dripping with water. It said nothing, just looked at me, then disappeared as if it had never been there. Now, I stand here, looking down into the dark lake. Someday, I know I will come here too, not as an observer, but as part of the lake. But not today. Every time I get closer, I feel like something is calling, an invisible force pulling me down into the darkness. I tell myself that the lake is just part of tradition, but deep down, I know it is something more. The lake never sleeps. It breathes, it lives, and it is always waiting. I never thought I would be the main character in my own family's strange stories. It all started on a completely normal night, or at least I thought so. I woke up around 2 a.m., feeling the familiar pangs of insomnia. My eyes were closed, but my mind was still awake, and I decided to curl up in bed, scrolling through TikTok to kill time. That's when my mother burst into the room, a look of confusion and panic on her face. My mother, who was not easily frightened, looked at me as if I had done something inexplicable. She was breathing heavily, her voice trembling as she asked, "Were you in my bed?" I shook my head. "No, I've been here all along." Her eyes were fixed on me, as if searching my face for any sign of deception. After a few seconds, she leaned down, leaning against the doorframe as if to keep her balance, before recounting what she had just experienced. According to her, she woke up in the dark, feeling someone climb into bed and lie on top of her. Her hand, reflexively, reached for my head, feeling the rough curls against her face. She thought I was frightened by a nightmare or something, so she gently asked, "What's wrong, son? Do you want to lie here with me?" But I did not answer. Instead, I looked up at her. In the darkness, she couldn't see her face clearly, but the look sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't my gaze, at least, not the gaze she was familiar with. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes again, I was gone. Only the cold air filled the room. My mom came running into my room. When she saw me lying comfortably on the bed, scrolling through TikTok, she seemed at a loss for words. For the first time in my life, I saw real fear in my mom's eyes. That wasn't the only time my mom saw me. A week later, when I came home late from school for sports practice, She said she saw me out of the corner of her eye, sitting on the couch in the living room. She even heard soft breathing and the sound of clothes rubbing against each other, like when I sat watching TV. When she turned to speak, no one was there. The room was empty, except for the dim light from the TV screen playing the show she had been watching. At first, she tried to ignore it. She thought she was probably tired or imagining things due to the light and shadows in the house. But the apparitions became more frequent. Sometimes she saw me standing silently in the hallway, head slightly bowed as if in thought. Other times, she caught a glimpse of me coming out of the kitchen, but when she ran to check, there was only cold silence in response. I didn't know what to think of what my mother was saying. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all. Maybe she was just nervous, or her mind was playing tricks on her. But another part of me couldn't deny the creepy feeling I had as I walked into the house, as if an invisible eye was watching me. Things really came to a head one evening when I was home alone. My mom was working late, and I decided to spend the evening relaxing in the living room. The lights were on in the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the dark. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw myself, a blurry figure with distinctive bushy hair, standing in the corner of the room. When I turned my head to look directly at it, it was gone, as if it had never existed. But the chill it left behind was very real. The air in the room seemed more stifling, and I couldn't shake the thought that my copy was still there, lurking in the shadows where the light couldn't reach. Things came to a head the next night. I woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. My room was dark, save for the dim light from the bedside lamp on my desk. I closed my eyes, trying to fall back asleep, but then I felt something moving. I opened my eyes and found myself standing at the end of the bed. Not a reflection, not an illusion. It was me, or at least a distorted copy of me. Its face was like mine, but its eyes were black as an abyss, so deep that I felt as if I were being sucked into them. It said nothing, just stood there, staring with a soft but malicious smile. I screamed, but when my mother ran in, the figure was gone. After that night, my mother and I decided to investigate the house and the strange events. Through conversations with neighbors and some of the elders in the neighborhood, we learned that this house used to be the home of another family. The mother of that family lost her son in a tragic accident right in this house. Surprisingly, the boy was the same age as me and even looked quite similar to me. Perhaps the boy's soul is still lurking somewhere, trying to find a connection, a comfort that it has lost. But what's more frightening is it just the soul of a lost child, or is something else more dangerous using my image to approach my mother? I'm not sure anymore. But every time I pass a mirror in my house, I always take a second glance, afraid that my reflection won't move with me, or worse, will smile. Route 66 stretched out before me, a rusty strip of asphalt through the barren wilderness. There were no people, no cars. The temperature was so high that the asphalt seemed to shimmer, steaming like waves of air. Farther out on the horizon, a few gaunt cacti stretched out like skeletal arms against the endless desert. I felt like I was in a grim sketch, each stroke only emphasizing the isolation. With every mile I walked, the emptiness inside me grew heavier. The days seemed to melt together, blending into a vague stupor. I hadn't slept enough or eaten properly, and perhaps that had left me disoriented. Everything inside me was numb, both physically and mentally. As I rolled past a rusted sign hanging off its side by a rusty chain, I saw the Bluefin Diner for the first time. It appeared out of nowhere like a mirage. The diner stood alone in the dry land, like a living tomb for lost souls. The wooden boards were peeling, the glass doors were covered in dust. Above it, a sign flickered with a faint, uneven blue light, giving the diner a gloomy invitation. Though I tried to ignore it, I noticed the handwritten sign on the glass door, "Help Wanted." The handwriting was scribbled and crooked, as if drawn by the trembling hand of someone in despair. It was strange, but it drew me in. For some reason, I felt like the place was calling me, pulling me closer. As I turned off the engine and got out of the car, the desert air was heavy. The smell of dust and dry sand filled my nostrils, but it was accompanied by another, more indescribable smell, like rusted metal mixed with something rotting. I looked around but saw no one. The silence was unbearable. Not even the wind blowing made a sound. I walked across the gravel parking lot, my shoes clicking against the hard ground like a lost echo in the air. The heavy glass door creaked as I opened it, and the bell rang in the dark restaurant like a reluctant invitation. Inside, the restaurant is an odd mix of past and decay. The old vinyl seats are cracked, revealing the brown cushions underneath. Dust covers every corner of the walls, and the wallpaper is stained yellow from humidity and time. A few neon lights on the ceiling still glow, but their light flickers and flickers, casting a ghostly glow over the room. I walked slowly through the empty booths. It was so quiet I could hear my footsteps echoing off the walls. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and stale coffee. A claustrophobic feeling enveloped me, as if I were intruding on a place not meant for humans to live. Behind the counter, an old man stood silently. His face was wrinkled and gaunt, with sunken eyes that looked like they had never slept. He said nothing, just stared at me with a strange gaze, as if assessing something incomprehensible. I tried to smile hesitantly, but received no response. Instead, he slowly turned away, his shoulders slightly hunched as if weighed down by the weight of the world. I chose a booth in the corner and sat down. When I touched the seat, the vinyl upholstery clung to my skin, cold enough to make me jump. I glanced at the menu on the table, yellowed paper stained with coffee, but nothing stood out. Everything here seemed frozen in time. The old man brought me a cup of coffee I hadn't ordered. The cup was chipped and stained with yellow, but I didn't dare complain. I took a sip, and the bitter, scorching taste made me wince. It seemed to have been brewed in a machine that hadn't been serviced for decades. But I didn't care. I needed the clarity, the reason to stay here a little longer, to calm the anxiety that was tearing at me. The old man's eyes never left me. He stood behind the counter, his rough hands wiping a clean glass, as if it were the only habit he had left. Nothing moved, but I felt I was not alone. As if beneath this space, another world operated silently and waited. As the dim light from the sign outside filtered in, I noticed something strange. There were strange marks on the wall near the window, water stains, as if someone had been leaning against them in wet clothes. I didn't remember seeing anyone come in, and there was no sign of recent rain or water. But I quickly brushed it off, convincing myself that I was probably imagining things. This diner, with its decaying space and silent gazes, had a strange attraction that made me unable to leave. When I looked up at the faded sign outside that read "Help Wanted," I knew I would stay here. Maybe because I had nowhere else to go. Or maybe deep down, I knew that my journey would not end in a normal place. As I sat quietly in the booth, the old man stood behind the counter, his sunken eyes watching me without blinking. The atmosphere around me was thick, as if the entire space of the restaurant was holding its breath. I felt an invisible pressure pressing down on my chest, but I tried to ignore it, clearing my throat lightly to break the silence. Finally, the old man approached slowly, his legs shuffling as if each movement sapped all his remaining strength. He placed his hands on the counter, his fingers thin and calloused with grease. There was something in his eyes that made me shiver. Not the usual indifference, but a strange weariness, a mixture of resignation and quiet fear. When I told him I wanted the job, he asked no questions. No name, no resume, no questions about my experience. He just nodded, his lips pursed, as if he had been waiting for this for a long time. He turned away, motioning for me to follow, and we set off on a strange tour that I will never forget. The restaurant looked small from the outside, but once inside, I realized it was like a miniature maze. Doors led to the kitchen, the restrooms, the pantry, all of them old and dark, as if they had been neglected for decades. He pointed to each area without saying much. Each word he spoke was slow and heavy, as if it carried the weight of a secret I was not privy to. As we entered the kitchen, a wave of cold air hit me. The room was filled with rusty pots and pans, hanging from flimsy chains from the ceiling. Every step on the cracked linoleum floor made a creaking sound, as if the room were protesting our presence. An old gas stove sat in the corner, its knobs coated in grease. But what stopped me was the small window above the sink. I looked out the window and saw the lake. It was not far from the restaurant. The water was black as ink, so calm that it reflected the faint light from the night sky. There was something about the lake that I couldn't take my eyes off. A strange, almost hypnotic attraction that forced me to look deep into that darkness. The old man stood beside me, his eyes also following the lake. But unlike my curiosity, his eyes were filled with worry, even fear. When we returned to the front of the restaurant, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of old paper. The scribbles on it looked like they had been written in haste, the handwriting shaky, as if the writer's hand were shaking with fear. He set the paper down on the counter, tapping it lightly with his finger, as if to emphasize its importance. I skimmed through the lines. Do not go near the lake for any reason. If you see wet footprints leading from the lake to the restaurant, wash them off immediately with hot water. If you hear scratching on the window, mind your business. The lights in the restaurant must always be dimmed, never turned off. Each rule was more of a warning than a guide. I couldn't help but ask, why follow these? But the old man's eyes stopped me. They looked at me as if they had seen worse than I could imagine. A deep fear, but no longer panic, just resignation. I turned back to the booth, trying to digest what I had just read. The atmosphere in the diner had become heavier, as if the rules themselves had changed the entire energy of the place. The light from the neon sign outside was reflected in it, casting strange shadows on the walls. I stared absently at the cup of coffee in front of me. The small ripples on the surface of the liquid seemed to dance to some inexplicable rhythm. When I looked up, the old man was gone. His slow footsteps echoed from the kitchen, but I didn't dare stand up and follow. I felt abandoned, as if the restaurant was slowly swallowing me up in darkness. I told myself that this was just a temporary job, just a way to make some money before I left. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The restaurant was filled with an eerie silence, the only sound being the hum of the old refrigerator and the faint flickering of the neon sign outside. I sat behind the counter, my eyes following the shadows that loomed in the corners. The atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, the silence no longer peaceful, but an invisible, oppressive pressure. Around 1 a.m., the silence was broken by a soft but haunting sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as it grew clearer, I realized it was a melody. The sound was smooth and singing, but it did not belong to any language or song I knew. The melody was not loud, just a whisper in the air, but it had a strange attraction, as if calling me, pulling me away from the restaurant. I turned to the window. The lake lay silent in the darkness, its inky surface reflecting the faint light of the night sky. The melody seemed to emanate from the lake, wafting through the air, a haunting invitation. Something inside me urged me to step outside, toward the lake to find the source of the strange sound. I stood up, my feet moving toward the door without thinking. My hand touched the doorknob, and at that moment, a cold feeling ran down my spine, as if I had touched something that did not belong to this world. I paused, still staring into the darkness outside the door, and then I saw it, a fleeting movement on the water. A shadowy, ghostly figure hovered just above the surface of the lake. It was indistinct, just a shimmering shape, but what froze me in place was the way it moved. It didn't look like a swimmer, nor like any creature I knew. It moved as if it didn't belong here, as if gravity had no hold on it. The melody grew louder, seemingly coming from the shadowy figure itself. Each note crept into my mind, awakening vague memories and forgotten fears. I felt like I was being pulled into an inescapable vortex, part of me wanting to run away, but another part drawn in by the enchantment of the sound. Just as I was about to leave, a movement in the corner of my eye stopped me. I looked down and noticed something tucked into the seat next to the counter. It was an old, crumpled piece of paper with scribbled handwriting on it. It looked like it had been there for a long time, and when I picked it up, the words on it made my heart pound. Under no circumstances should you go near the lake. The warning echoed in my head, pulling me back to reality. I looked back at the door, feeling as if the entire space outside was waiting for me to make a mistake. The shape on the water was still there, but the melody had changed. It was no longer gentle, but darker, like a long, drawn-out wail, filled with despair and hatred. I stepped back, fighting the urge to step outside. I turned back to the counter, my hands still clutching the paper as a reminder. But when I sat down, the melody did not stop. It drifted through the air, as if it had penetrated my very mind. I covered my ears, but it did not help. The sound was not just outside. It was inside my head, playing over and over again. Every second was a struggle. I tried to focus on other things, but the melody kept pulling me toward the door. I glanced at the clock, hoping my shift was about to end, but the hour hand seemed to have stopped. The atmosphere in the diner felt suffocating, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I tried to think of the rules the old man had given me. Do not go near the lake. I repeated the phrase like a mantra, clinging to it like a life preserver. But each time I said it, the melody grew louder, more haunting, as if it were teasing my weakness. Finally, I forced myself to stand up and walk to the back of the kitchen to get some fresh air. But as soon as I entered, my eyes were drawn to the small window. The lake was still there, quiet and dark, but this time I noticed something strange. A small column of water was swirling in the middle of the lake, as if something was rising from the endless depths. I swallowed, the feeling of being watched becoming stronger than ever. For a brief moment, I swore I saw a face, pale and disfigured, just beneath the surface of the water. Its empty eyes stared straight at me, and a twisted smile appeared on that hideous face. I screamed and backed away, but when I looked back, the water was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I turned back to the front of the restaurant, cold sweat pouring down my face. The melody finally stopped, leaving a heavy, ominous silence. I tried to calm myself, but the image from the lake still haunted me. I knew this was only the beginning. Something in this place, something beyond the lake, was watching me, waiting for the right moment. I sat back behind the counter, my hands shaking as I clutched my cold coffee. I no longer felt alone. Instead, I felt surrounded. But I also knew that I couldn't run away. Not tonight. I could only hope that the rules would protect me from whatever was waiting in the dark. The night dragged on, heavy and gloomy. I sat behind the counter, my eyes fixed on the window, where the pale neon light reflected off the glass. The restaurant was completely empty, save for the oppressive silence and the faint hum of the old refrigerator. Time seemed to drag on endlessly, each passing minute a test of endurance. I tried to focus on my work, to ignore the unsettling feelings that were creeping up on me. I wiped down the counters, washed the chipped glasses, but every little movement made me feel as if something was watching me. Every little sound, the creak of the floor, the faint whistling of the wind through the door, made me jump. As I was cleaning the back kitchen, a faint sound rang out. At first, I thought it was just water dripping from an old pipe, but the sound was irregular. It was like a soft tapping on the floor, rhythmic and steady. I stood still, listening, trying to determine its source. Then I looked down at the floor and saw them. Wet footprints stretching from the front door deep into the restaurant. Dark, water-stained tracks on the linoleum, too clear and too large to be human. They didn't look like normal footprints. Each one was longer, narrower, with lines that looked more like the imprint of a hand than a foot. Remembering the rule on the paper, I felt my heart sink. If you see wet footprints leading from the lake to the restaurant, wash them off immediately with hot water. My hands shook as I picked up the bucket and turned on the hot water. Steam rose, creating a thin mist around me, but I barely felt the heat. My mind was focused on the strange tracks. When I turned back, the footprints seemed to have moved. They were no longer in the same place as when I first saw them. They were farther away, closer to the counter where I had been sitting. A cold fear spread through my body, but I forced myself to act. I dipped the rag into the bucket of hot water, my hand trembling as I touched each wet spot. Steam rose as I wiped away the footprints, and as I did so, I heard a faint hissing sound, like metal melting. I didn't dare look up, didn't dare look out the window, where the darkness seemed to thicken. But I felt it, a presence, an invisible gaze, pressing down on me. The screeching stopped, replaced by a new sound. A light scratching sound came from the window at the back of the diner. At first, it was very light, like a tree branch scraping against the glass. But the scratching soon became clearer, more persistent. It was relentless, each stroke stretching out as if to pierce the air. I remembered the rule. If you hear scratching on your window, ignore it. My breathing quickened as I tried to obey, my eyes glued to the floor, my hands still wiping away the last traces of water. But the sound seemed to creep into my mind, each scratching sound inviting me to look away. I forced myself to concentrate on my work, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore and glanced out the window from the corner of my eye. A tall, thin figure was standing outside, its shadow reflected in the glass. Its body was distorted, unclear, as if it didn't belong to this world. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, too cold, sharp rays of light piercing straight at me. I forced myself to turn away, cold sweat running down my forehead. But even without looking, I could feel its presence, feel its gaze burning into my back. The scratching continued, each stroke growing longer, as if the creature was losing patience. Finally, the scratching stopped, leaving a deadly silence. I didn't know if it had left or was still waiting, but I didn't dare move. My heart was pounding, cold sweat soaked my shirt. I sat still as a statue, trying not to make any noise. As dawn approached, the old man returned. He entered with heavy eyes, looking around the restaurant as if searching for signs of something. When I told him what had happened, he just nodded silently, his eyes showing fatigue and pain. He showed no surprise, no shock, as if he had known this would happen. "Tonight is the last night," he said, his voice full of mystery and guilt. I didn't dare ask more, but in my heart I knew the worst was yet to come. He said, "My last night at the Bluefin Diner began with a dark heaviness that I couldn't shake. The shadows in the diner seemed longer, thicker, as if the darkness itself had seeped into every corner. I tried to go about my normal routine, cleaning tables, checking the kitchen afterward, but anxiety gnawed at my mind. Something was waiting, as if it knew this would be my last night there. As the clock struck midnight, everything in the diner became eerily quiet. There was no more hum from the old refrigerator, no more wind whistling outside the window. The silence was not peaceful. It carried the weight of invisible danger, as if the whole world were holding its breath. I stood behind the counter, my eyes fixed on the door. A sound rang out in the silence, a creaking of wood, as if someone had stepped onto the steps outside. I turned, my heart pounding, but there was no one through the window. Outside was only vast darkness, and the distant lake shimmered with pale moonlight. Then the jukebox cracked, a sudden noise that startled me. The music it played was distorted and incomplete, the notes drifting out as if from somewhere far away and forgotten. The melody was harsh and creepy, as if the music itself was haunted by something not of this world. I rushed to the record player, trying to turn it off, but the buttons were unresponsive. The music grew louder and louder, as if it were taunting me, lengthening each note to torture me. I felt my hands shaking, a cold sweat breaking out, but there was nothing I could do. In desperation, I covered the record player with a towel, but the sound continued to echo, piercing through the fabric, a reminder that I had no control over anything here. The music abruptly stopped, but not to the point of peace. A sharp scratching sound came from the window behind me, a sound reminiscent of shredded metal. I held my breath, trying not to turn around, but the scratching grew louder, more steady, as if something out there was patiently waiting for me to let my guard down. I remembered the rule: if you hear scratching, ignore it. But it was harder than I thought. The scratching was more than just a sound. It carried an invisible feeling, a dark pull that drew me toward the window. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a shadowy shape. Tall and thin, it stood silently, only its eyes shining through the darkness, watching me. I forced myself to turn away, focusing on the plates on the counter. My hands slid across the slippery surface, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was getting closer, inch by inch, each scratch like an invisible footstep. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the main door opened. The owner walked in, his face paler than usual, his sunken eyes filled with fatigue and something like surrender. He looked at me, his eyes filled with guilt. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. Before I could comprehend what he was saying, he walked to the window and began to unlatch it. My heart sank. I rushed forward, screaming, trying to stop him, but he turned to look at me, his eyes empty, like those of a man who had lost everything. "Don't do it." I wanted to scream, but no words came out. Before I could act, the window flew open, and darkness rushed in like a flood. The creature slithered in, its body contorted and unnatural, its movements slithering like a snake. Its mouth opened wide, revealing razor-sharp teeth. It moved with incredible agility, lunging at the old man before I could react. He screamed, a scream that echoed throughout the restaurant, but it didn't last long. The creature wrapped itself around him, its teeth digging into his neck, blood spurting out, creating a long trail on the floor. I stood rooted to the spot, horrified by the sight before me, unable to do anything but back away. The old man was dragged towards the open window, his body writhing in despair. His eyes looked at me one last time, full of regret and pleading. But there was nothing I could do. The creature dragged him out, disappearing into the darkness outside, leaving only deathly silence. I turned and ran. I dashed out of the diner, leaving everything behind. My legs, guided by survival instinct, did not stop for a second. As I climbed into the car and started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The diner was silent and dark, but from the window, I saw the creature's glowing eyes watching me. I drove away, not stopping, not looking back. But as I drove off Route 66, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow of the diner was still following me, that the creature was still waiting, just waiting for a chance to pull me back. I woke up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. 3 regular knocks on the door, cutting through the silence of the house. Everything around me seemed to be shrouded in a hazy haze. I glanced at the bedside clock, 3:15 a.m. A sense of unease rose within me, not because the knocking was unusual, but because of its regularity. The perfect rhythm, 3 knocks every 3 seconds, as if there was some hidden intention in the darkness outside. I sat up, my hands unconsciously gripping the blanket as a way to protect myself. The knocking continued, neither faster nor slower. The usually quiet house was now filled with the suffocating repetition of sounds. Each knock echoed throughout the space, penetrating every corner, as if it were trying to penetrate the walls of the room. I quietly got out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor. The air seemed different, thicker and more oppressive. The knocking on the door was no longer just a sound but a presence, an invitation that could not be ignored. I walked down the stairs, each step creaking on the old wooden floor. The hallway was dark, only the dim light from the street lamps shining through the windows, revealing strange shadows on the walls. I stood in front of the front door, looking through the peephole, but no one was there. I turned on the porch light, and the light was so weak that it seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness. I opened the door a crack, and a cold wind blew in, carrying the dampness of the night. But there was still nothing outside, just deep darkness. I stepped out onto the porch, a strange feeling permeating every cell. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but something was off. The trees weren't rustling, there were no insects chirping. Even the light from the street lamps seemed to be overshadowed by the darkness. I turned to close the door, but an urge forced me to look again. That's when I realized the knocking wasn't coming from the front door. It comes from inside the house. I stood there, my breath hitching as I realized the truth. The knocking, which had seemed to come from the front door, now echoed clearly from deep inside the house. It was no longer 3 steady knocks, but a slower, heavier rhythm, as if someone was carefully crafting each sound. Each knock was a whisper, a hidden message, creeping into my mind. My heart was pounding as I stepped back into the house, carefully closing the front door. The atmosphere in the house now felt different, as if everything around me had changed. The familiar house suddenly felt strange. I tried to determine the direction of the knocking. It was coming from upstairs, from my bedroom to be exact. I hesitated, my feet heavy, as if they were loaded with stones. My mind was spinning with thoughts and theories. Was someone in the house? But how could that be? I had just left. The knocking continued, each one echoing in the heavy silence of the night, like a ghostly invitation. Step by step, I climbed the stairs, each creaking louder than usual. I tried to steady my breathing, but the cold air and tension made my lungs constrict. As I approached the bedroom door, the knocking stopped, leaving a silence so abrupt that my ears rang. I stood in front of the door, my hand trembling on the doorknob. I couldn't explain it, but there was a strange feeling that something was waiting for me inside. The old wooden door was nothing special, but at the moment it felt like a curtain separating me from another world, a world I wasn't sure I wanted to enter. I turned the doorknob slowly, inch by inch. As the door opened, a cold gust of air blew out from inside, carrying with it a musty smell. The room was dark, with only the faint light from the window illuminating the vague outlines of objects. But there was no one there. I walked in, feeling like everything in the room was watching me. As I reached the middle of the room, the wooden floor creaked beneath my feet. That's when I saw it, something under the bed. My eyes were immediately drawn to the strange darkness beneath the bed frame. I bent down, my body shaking with fear and irresistible curiosity. That was when I saw strange stains on the wooden floor, as if someone had crawled out from under the bed, leaving behind slimy traces. And then from the darkness, a faint sound rang out, a faint but sharp whisper. It comes knocking at the door. My throat was dry, my body numb for a moment. When I looked up, the dim light from the window reflected a tall shadow standing right in front of me, blocking my entire vision. The tall shadow that blocked my vision made my heart stop. The faint light from the window behind me seemed to be completely swallowed by the shadowy figure. It stood motionless, a dark entity that seemed to be made from the darkness of the room itself. I couldn't make out a face or any other details, only an overwhelming presence, carrying a chill that seeped into my very bones. A moment passed, or perhaps centuries, before I realized that the thing was not completely still. Small movements, like gentle waves, seemed to spread through its body. It was as if it were not a fixed entity but a flow, an entity that was constantly changing shape. The air in the room became heavy, stifling, as if I were standing in deep water and the pressure was crushing me. As I backed away, the floor beneath me creaked, breaking the eerie silence. My eyes, or whatever they might be, flashed for a moment. It wasn't natural light, but rather a strange reflection, eyes that were empty but filled with an unnameable terror. Then, without words, a feeling came into my mind. Not a clear voice, but an idea, a message as if engraved into my thoughts. It did not ask, it commanded. It has arrived. My body stiffened. I tried to open my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Even without physical hands, I felt like an invisible pressure was holding me in place. The presence didn't need to touch me to control me. It had taken up all the space in my head. Suddenly, the knocking sound came again. But this time, it wasn't coming from any door in the house. Instead, the sound echoed from under the floor, strong, slow knocks, as if from deep underground. Knock, knock, knock. Panic filled my mind as I realized the tapping was moving, getting closer. Each one reverberated off the floor beneath me, as if something enormous was trying to climb up from below. The dark presence didn't move, but I felt a connection between it and the sound, as if it were a summoner, a guide. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. Fear was like a rope, pulling me closer instead of pushing me away. The pressure on my body grew, and I felt like I was being sucked into the center of the darkness before me. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving a deadly silence. Then, beneath my feet, the wooden floor began to crack. Dark cracks appeared, giving off the damp, rotting smell of centuries-old earth. A black liquid, like tar, began to seep from the cracks, spreading across the floor like a flood. The liquid crawled up my legs, clinging to my skin drop by drop, chilling me to the bone. I struggled, but the more I moved, the tighter the liquid wrapped around me, like tentacles pulling me down. The shadow in front of me began to lean down, bringing its distorted face closer to mine. I couldn't see clearly, but it felt like my whole body was engulfed by its gaze. "It comes knocking," the thought rang through my mind again, stronger this time, like a resounding bell. I felt myself losing consciousness, as if darkness had not only taken over the room, but also swallowed my mind. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the black figure suddenly disappeared. The air in the room felt light, as if it had all been an illusion. But the floor was still cracked, and the black liquid still smelled disgusting. I tried to get up, but realized that I had lost all feeling in my legs. They were completely covered in that liquid, now hard as stone. It wasn't the end. There was a final knock on the door, this time coming from inside my own chest. Our town was small, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. From birth, we were taught two unbreakable rules: never leave town and never ask about missing children. These two rules were the cornerstone of everyone's lives, an integral part of the culture, as if they had existed before humans. Adults often said that the forbidden forest was a dangerous place, where monsters lurked in the dark. The stories they told were never specific, just vague images of giant shadows and howls in the night. We grew up fearing the forest, but gradually that fear became a natural thing. No one questioned it, no one dared to ask questions. But then, Emily's disappearance changed everything. Emily wasn't like the others who disappeared. She wasn't homeless or an abandoned child. She was the brightest person I'd ever known, with a smile that could light up a room. When she disappeared, the town remained silent, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't accept that. She couldn't just go away like the thoughtless excuses adults gave her. And so, one moonlit night, Jason, Tyler, and Lily and I decided to break the first rule. We had no choice. If no one was looking for Emily, we would do it. As we left the house, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the entire town were watching us as we walked. The cobblestone streets gave way to dirt, and the dim lights disappeared completely as we entered the forbidden forest. As we walked deeper, things became more and more eerie. The air smelled strange, like rust mixed with damp, rotting earth. The trees were tall, their branches intertwined in strange patterns, like hideous hands reaching out from the darkness. At first, we moved together, holding hands to keep calm. But as the light from the flashlights faded, the darkness became so thick it seemed alive, engulfing our senses. I don't remember how far we walked, only that the sense of time and space seemed to be distorted. Our footsteps echoed, but there seemed to be another, soft but persistent, following closely behind. We found it after about an hour. In the dim light, we saw a giant spider web strung between two trees, glistening with a slimy substance that reflected the light. Something was hanging from the web, a human figure. At first, I thought it was a corpse. But as we got closer, the reality was worse. The body was not human. The bones were broken and reassembled in strange shapes. Joints were superfluous, arms long with claw-like fingers. The eyes were deep black holes, but they were not empty. Something was moving inside them, like thousands of tiny insects crawling. Lily screamed, breaking the silence of the forest. The thing in the web stirred, as if awakened. Its head turned toward us slowly, in short, unnatural jerks. Its mouth opened, emitting a strange whining sound. And then it began to move. It crawled like a spider, using all four long limbs to dive into the web. Its joints creaked as it moved. We stood there, stunned by the horror. Only when the flashlight flickered did I snap out of my terror and run screaming. We ran without stopping, rushing through trees and bushes, ignoring the branches that scratched our skin. I don't know how far we ran, but my heart was pounding and my legs seemed unable to stop. Then we saw the cabin. It was tucked away in a corner of the woods, almost blending into the darkness. But the light from its windows was different, white and cold, like the light from a laboratory. My heart clenched as I realized this was no shelter. This was where the nightmare began. Inside, faint sounds drifted out, screams, cries, and the clash of metal. I turned to look at my friends. Lily was sobbing, Jason was whispering something to Tyler, but no one had the courage to step forward. But I can't go back. Emily might be in there. I walked up, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. What I saw inside will haunt me forever. The old wooden door swung open with a long, echoing groan that echoed in the heavy silence of the forest. I stepped in first, feeling the air in the cabin suddenly become heavier, as if I had passed through an invisible curtain. My friends followed, but I could hear their footsteps slowing, hesitant as they faced the space before them. Inside the cabin was a larger space than I expected. Ceiling lights cast a cold white light over an oddly arranged room. Along the walls were iron cages, each barely larger than a human body. The rusted bars were coated in a black liquid that dripped onto the rotting wooden floor. In each cage was a child or teenager. Some lay motionless, gaunt bodies with pale skin and vacant eyes. Others huddled in corners, arms wrapped around their knees, weak sobs escaping from their parched throats. A nearby cage caught my attention. A boy no older than me, his face bruised and his eyes dull, stared at me. But as I tried to get closer, his eyes snapped open, wide with an eerie light. His mouth opened, and from within came a hissing sound, not human but something deep and unnatural. I backed away, my foot hitting an empty bucket, the metallic sound echoing in the air. It was then that I saw Emily. She was strapped to a giant machine in the middle of the room. Large tubes were embedded in her body, each pump and pulse sending spasms through her body. One of her arms was completely deformed, elongated and covered in a hard, carapace-like sheath. Her fingertips were no longer nails but sharp claws, glinting in the light. Emily's face was the same as I remembered, except for her eyes. They were no longer the warm brown eyes I knew, but two glowing red points, as if something were looking through her. A scream came from another cage, breaking the tension. I turned and saw one of the children clinging to the bars, making incomprehensible noises. But before I could do anything, an adult appeared. They were not the normal adults in our town. Their clothes were sleek, impeccably tailored. Their black suits were exquisitely tailored. Their expensive watches glittered in the light. But what chilled me were their faces, blank, rigid, expressionless, as if they had lost their humanity. One of them held a glass of wine, swirling it gently as he watched the machine with a sickening fascination. Emily jerked, her body convulsing painfully. The pump drew a crimson liquid through the tubes, and I realized it wasn't just blood, it was thick black like something poisoned. Emily screamed, but the scream wasn't entirely human. It was somewhere between a scream and a high-pitched screech, as if two entities were fighting for control of her body. Lily tugged at my hand, her eyes brimming with tears. But I couldn't leave. Emily looked at me. Her red eyes met mine, as if she was trying to say something. She didn't say it, but I understood. She wanted us out of here. She didn't want us to get caught up in it. Jason pulled me along, but before we could turn away, a loud noise rang out. One of the children had broken free of its cage. But instead of running away, it lunged at the machine, its body jerking in unnatural ways. Its head turned 180 degrees, and a terrifying roar came from its mouth. The adults stood up immediately, their eyes flashing with satisfaction. One of them laughed, a cold, dry sound, before signaling to the others. They weren't scared. They'd expected this. Emily cringed, her body stretched by the straps. I saw her hands jerk, then break the bonds. She lifted her head, and a scream that was no longer human escaped her. Darkness seemed to gather around her, black veins standing out against her pale skin. Jason screamed, and that's when we ran. We rushed out of the cabin, breathing heavily, our feet stampeding over everything in our path. A roar came from behind, mixed with the wild laughter of the adults. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel the darkness chasing us, as if it were a living entity. By the time we reached the edge of town, it was dawn. No one said a word. The group knew that no one would believe us, and worse, I wasn't sure I could fully comprehend what had just happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. Emily's shrill scream, the red eyes glowing in the dark, and the cold smiles of the adults still echoed in my head. But what terrified me the most was the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom window. They didn't sound like human footsteps. They sounded like the scratching of a creature with sharp claws. The snow was falling thickly, covering the road ahead in a blanket of white. My car rolled slowly through the icy fog, the tires screeching against the icy pavement like a wail. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. There was something different about the night. Maybe it was because I was alone, or maybe it was because the fog was so thick that even the headlights were swallowed up, leaving only a faint glow ahead. I told myself not to stop. Every year, my family and I went to the Everest Christmas tree farm to pick out a tree. But this year everyone was busy. I was the only one who could go get a tree. So here I was, alone on a deserted road, walking through the freezing snow to keep the family tradition alive. Yet something deep inside me was making me uneasy. Memories of my childhood came flooding back. Everest Base Camp had always felt strange to me, especially the large forest on the hill behind it. My parents had always forbidden my brother and I from going up there, saying it was easy to get lost in the tall, dense trees. But children don't listen. One year, my brother and I decided to explore the area. We got lost, and I remember seeing something. A vague figure lurking among the tall trees. The memory was faint, but it left a dark mark in my mind, an unexplained fear. Suddenly, the car engine made a strange noise and died. Its last low growl was lost in the howling wind outside. I tried to turn the key back on, but the car wouldn't start. A feeling of helplessness filled me as I looked at my phone screen. No signal. I was completely isolated in the middle of a snowy night, with no one to see me. I stepped outside, the cold air cutting across my face, my breath turning into thin wisps of mist. I began to walk, hoping to find help or at least shelter. Old memories continued to creep in, drowning my mind in fragments of the time I had been lost in the woods that year. Darkness surrounded me, and every step only led me deeper into a strange feeling, as if I were entering another world. Then I saw the familiar sign, Everest Christmas Tree Farm. I had arrived after all. But relief quickly gave way to anxiety when I saw no one there. No lights, no voices, no cars. The whole farm was deathly silent. I called out, but only my own echo answered. I walked past the rows of trimmed trees, into the central area where the plant vendors usually stood. But there was no one. Only the fog grew thicker, wrapping around me like an invisible hand, cold and haunting. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. The sound was unclear, but I was sure it was calling my name. I turned, but saw no one. A chill ran down my spine as the feeling of being watched grew more and more pronounced. I walked faster, almost running as I tried to escape the feeling. But the fog did not let up. It covered everything, forcing me to continue toward the hill behind the farm. I found myself standing in front of a row of large trees, towering like giant pillars. All the old fear came rushing back, but this time it was much stronger. I stood frozen in front of the hill, where ancient trees towered tall in the thick fog. My legs felt frozen, refusing to move, but the fog behind me was like an invisible wall, pushing me forward. My heart pounded in my chest, and each heavy step echoed in the eerie silence. Memories of the past suddenly came flooding back. I remembered going up to this area with my brother one winter many years ago. We were lost among the tall, dense trees, the cold wind whistling through the leaves, carrying an indescribable whisper. I remembered seeing a vague figure, standing still among the trees. A tall, slender, yet strange shadow, as if it did not belong to this world. When I called out to my brother, the shadow disappeared, leaving me with a nameless fear. That night, I told no one, only knowing that I never wanted to return to this place. But now, here I was again, inevitably. The fog enveloped me, cutting me off from the outside world. The air seemed frozen, and the world was all I had left, along with the silent trees, as if waiting for something to happen. Then I saw her. A slender figure emerged from the mist ahead, slowly approaching me. My heart stopped as the figure became clearer. A woman in a tattered white dress, her long black hair covering her face. She stood motionless, just a few meters away from me, but there was no sound of footsteps on the snow. The pale moonlight shone on her, giving her an eerie beauty, graceful yet unsettling. She raised her head, revealing her face. It was surreally pale, her eyes deep and black as the abyss. Her mouth moved, and I heard a faint sound like the wind whistling through the branches, a voice whispering my name. For some reason, I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. I could only stare at the strange woman, feeling chills running down my spine. She didn't come any closer, but her presence was like an invisible pressure, weighing down on me, making me suffocate. Then she raised her hand, her thin arm pointing toward the top of the hill. I didn't understand why, but I knew she wanted me to follow. A deep fear filled my heart, but my feet lifted of their own accord. as if I had no control over them. The higher I went, the thicker the fog became. The trees stood like ghosts in the darkness, and I felt like I was entering another world. The air around me became heavy, and I began to hear strange sounds. Whispers, small footsteps, and even a ghostly chuckle. Then I saw a small clearing, surrounded by tall, dense trees. The moonlight shone down, casting a faint glow over the place. In the clearing, I saw a shallow grave, a small mound covered with snow, but clear enough to make out that something had been buried there. The woman stood behind me, watching silently. She seemed to be waiting for something. I felt an invisible force pushing me toward the grave. Somehow, I knew I had to dig. My hands shook as I bent down to pick up a large nearby branch and began to scrape away the snow that covered it. As the first layer of snow was brushed away, I realized that this was more than just a grave. It was a memory, a secret that had been buried for years. Beneath the cold soil, I saw tattered white cloth, yellowed by time. And then I saw a hand, a thin, withered hand, as if it were trying to reach up from the ground. A feeling of utter terror made me want to run, but I couldn't. I was compelled to keep going, to dig deeper. The woman was still standing there, her dark eyes staring at me, as if she were judging me. I didn't dare look into her eyes, but I knew that I couldn't stop. When I turned the last layer of dirt, I saw a face. It was a woman's face. Her empty eyes stared straight at me, and her mouth opened as if she wanted to say something. But no sound came out. I stood frozen in front of the grave, feeling as if I was frozen in time and space. The woman's face beneath the dirt looked straight at me, her empty eyes as if wanting to pull me down with her. A cold wind suddenly blew by, carrying a gentle whistle like the whisper of an old forest. I knelt at the edge of the grave, my hands shaking as I lifted the remains of the cloth around the body. In the dim moonlight, I recognized what I had known deep down since I began this journey. This was the body of the woman who haunted my childhood memories, the woman I had seen buried in secret as a child. Suddenly, the memory came flooding back, sharp and clear like an inescapable nightmare. I remembered hiding behind a tree, shivering in the cold of the winter night, when I saw a faceless man carefully covering the woman's body with dirt. I was too scared to speak, and then the memory was gradually buried under a thick layer of time, like this grave. I turned to look at the woman standing behind me. She hadn't moved or said anything. Her eyes were filled with reproach but also relief, as if she'd been waiting for this for a long time. I tried to say something, but my throat was tight. Only my ragged breathing could be heard in the still air. When I bent down again, my hand touched something hard hidden in the dirt. It was a piece of bone, pale in the moonlight, and underneath it was a small silver necklace, still intact despite being buried for many years. I picked up the necklace, feeling a chill run through my fingertips. The pendant was engraved with a strange shape, like an ancient symbol, something familiar yet foreign, as if I had seen it in my dreams. As soon as I took it, a cold chill ran through me, and I heard a voice echoing in my head, not from the woman but from the surrounding forest. "Return justice, and I will let you go." I felt my whole body tremble, but I knew I couldn't turn away. The woman said nothing, but her eyes were fixed on the foot of the hill, where I saw a dark figure standing silently among the trees. The figure was exactly like the image in my memory, a faceless man, huge, standing still like a monument to death. He didn't move, but I could feel his invisible gaze on me, heavy as an accusation. I clutched the necklace, feeling like it was my only connection to reality, and began walking down the hill. The shadow did not come closer, but it was there, a landmark marking the path I had to take. As I drew closer, I realized he was standing in front of an old wooden door, half buried in the ground. There was no handle, only the same symbol as the necklace, carved into the rotten wood. I don't know where I got the courage, but I picked up the necklace and placed it on the symbol on the door. There was a screech, as if the whole forest was crying out in pain, and the door slowly opened. Inside was a small, cold, dark room. In the center of the room, a wooden table sat, with strange objects on it, a rusty knife, a few small bones, and a tattered old book with yellowed pages. On the opposite wall, a scribbled picture of a woman in a white dress, eyes as black as the abyss, and right next to it, an image of a faceless man. I flipped through the book, each page covered with black scribbles, describing rituals, secrets, and sins long buried. Finally, I found a short passage that sent a chill down my spine. The traitor will not rest in peace. He has buried the truth, and her soul will never rest until justice is done. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing. The faceless man was the one who had done it all. He had killed the woman, and now he was trying to keep her in this world, binding her soul to his crime. When I stepped out of the room, the shadow had disappeared. I looked up the hill, where the woman in white was still waiting. She looked at me, no longer with reproach, but with expectation. I knew that I had to bring the truth to light, so that she could rest in peace, and so that this forest could regain its peace. I left the Christmas tree farm with a heavy heart, but I knew I did the right thing. I would come back here, to the police, to let them know the truth, to get justice for her. But deep down, I knew that this forest would never be the same again. And as I drove away from the farm, I saw the image of the woman in the rearview mirror, standing silently among the trees, before disappearing into the mist forever. "17 days ago, I celebrated my 15th birthday in a quaint house on the outskirts of Munich, Germany. It was a small party, with just my family and a few close friends. Everything went as planned. Warm light from an antique chandelier, soft music echoing in the large living room, and the laughter of the guests. But something strange happened. Among the familiar faces, there was a man I didn't recognize. He stood in the corner of the room, smiling silently, not talking to anyone. His smile made me feel uneasy. Not because it was friendly, but because there was something wrong, distorted, as if it were not human. I asked my mother who had invited him, but she just laughed and said he was probably a friend of someone in the family. The others didn't seem to notice him either. Part of me felt sorry for him. Perhaps he was just a stranger looking to fit in, but the other part urged me to stay away from him. When it was time for me to open the present, he stood up. He was the last to approach me, holding a box wrapped in gray paper, tied with a simple rope. As he approached, the atmosphere in the room changed. A heavy feeling weighed down on me, as if the entire room had gone silent for a moment. He placed the gift in my hand, still wearing that strange smile. Without a word, he turned back to the corner of the room, as if his presence was just a shadow. I felt something was very wrong. When I opened the gift, inside was an old wooden drawer, and in that drawer was a painting. It was me and him, standing on a stone bridge, with dark water swirling below. In the painting, he still had that smile, and my face was cold and blank, as if I had seen something terrible. The small text below the picture sent a chill down my spine. "We'll see you again soon." I forced a smile and said thank you, but inside I was terrified. When the party ended, he disappeared. No one remembered when he left. 2 days later, as I was passing the old bridge in the woods near my house, I saw him again. He was standing there, on the edge of the bridge, his strange smile still there. My heart stopped when I realized that the bridge in the picture was this one. He looked straight at me, still smiling, and stepped into the dark water below. I screamed and ran home, but when I told them, no one believed me. They said I was imagining things. But I know what I saw was real, and that smile still haunts me every night. In the days after I saw him jump off the bridge, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of him standing on the edge of the bridge, that twisted smile, appeared clearly in my mind. It wasn't just fear, but also a feeling of being watched, as if he was still somewhere, always watching me. I tried talking to my mother about it again, but she insisted that I was imagining things, that the birthday party had made me too nervous. No one else seemed to remember the man. Even when I described his face and smile in detail, no one seemed to recognize him. A week later, I decided to return to the bridge. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was all an illusion. The bridge was deep in the woods, surrounded by towering oaks. The water below was murky, flowing slowly, as if it were keeping secrets of its own. As I approached the bridge, I felt an unusual chill in the air. The wind rustled through the trees like a whisper, and I felt as if someone was watching me. I stepped onto the bridge, my heart racing. The stone surface was cold beneath my feet, and in the middle of the bridge, I saw something glittering. It was a ring, a simple silver ring, with an intricate engraving on the inside. For Marianne, my forever companion. I didn't know who Marianne was, but a chill ran down my spine. I put the ring in my pocket and turned to leave the bridge. But as I walked, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned back, but saw no one. The footsteps continued, louder, faster, as if someone was running towards me. I panicked, dashed off the bridge, not daring to look back. When I got home, I slammed the door, gasping for air, and checked my pocket. The ring was gone. That night, I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise. It was a knock, 3 times, in a steady rhythm, coming from the front door. I didn't want to open the door, but curiosity got the better of me. When I looked through the peephole, my heart almost stopped. That's him. He stood there on the steps, with the same crooked smile. But the most terrifying thing was his eyes. They were unblinking, black as bottomless pits. He stood motionless, just smiling and looking straight at me. I didn't open the door, nor did I dare make a sound. But as I stepped back, the knocking came again, louder this time, as if he knew I was standing right there. The knocking stopped abruptly. I glanced outside again, and he was gone. But there was something on the steps that frightened me the most, the silver ring from the bridge, now lying there, shining in the moonlight. The bare branches stretched out like skinny fingers, ready to grab anyone who dared to pass. Pale moonlight filtered through the leaves, creating distorted shapes on the misty ground. I walked slowly, each step drowned in the crunch of dry branches breaking under my feet. The air was cold, as if the forest was holding its last breath. The path before me was dark, a haunting invitation to mysteries I knew I should not explore. The howls of wolves rang out in the distance, echoing through the mist. Crows flew by, their black shadows gliding over my head, and owls, their eyes glowing, watched me like invisible sentinels. As fatigue built up in my body, I found a small clearing in the woods. It wasn't big, but it was big enough for me to rest for the night. I gathered dry wood, gathered pine needles, and struck the last match in my pocket to light a small fire. The fire flickered, its light flickering, casting ghosts dancing on the tree trunks. I lay down, my tattered coat the only barrier between me and the cold ground. The warm fire seemed to comfort me, but deep in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I closed my eyes, but as I drifted off to sleep, a strange dream came to me. I was no longer in the woods. I was in a white room with barred windows. Distant screams echoed, like the wailing of forgotten souls. I looked through the window and saw a woman's face, pale, with bloodshot eyes and a horrible smile on her mouth. A loud bang woke me from my nightmare. The fire was still burning, but its light was fading. As I sat up, a voice in my head whispered like the wind through the leaves, "Don't stop. They're coming." Before I could even come to my senses, I heard a growl from behind me. I turned around and saw a pair of red eyes glowing in the mist. They glowed like two small flames, illuminating the tall, thin figure approaching me. The figure slowly came into focus. It was a woman, no, a creature. At first glance, she was beautiful, with fair skin and long, jet-black hair. She approached, smiling seductively. Before I knew it, we were standing very close to each other. But as she touched the flames, a scream tore through the night. Her flesh split open, revealing rotting flesh beneath. Her face was disfigured, her eyes glowing red like burning coals, and her sharp teeth were exposed. I was terrified, jumped up and ran. Growls and heavy footsteps echoed behind me. I knew she was chasing me, getting closer. Each step seemed to carry the nightmare that was weighing me down. I stumbled as I ran. Pain flared in my ankle, but I had no time to cry out. She was right on top of me, her face staring down at me in horror. In a flash, I used all my strength to push her away, then rushed forward. I ran to a river, the cold water flowing rapidly. Having no other choice, I jumped in. The icy cold water made me dizzy, but I managed to swim to the other side. When I got to the shore, I turned around. She was standing on the other side, her eyes blazing as she stared at me, but she did not step into the water. She just stood there, growling in despair, before slowly turning and disappearing into the night. I lay on the riverbank, the cold water still clinging to my skin, seeping through my layers of clothing, making my body shiver uncontrollably. My ankles ached, but I dared not linger. I did not know if she would come back, but that burning gaze haunted me, even after she was gone. The pale moonlight filtered through the twisted branches, making the forest around me seem like a haunted maze. I stood up and tried to crawl, searching for shelter. The bushes rustled around me, and I felt the invisible eyes of hundreds of creatures following me. Finally, I found a small, old, dilapidated house, nestled in the middle of the forest. The faint light from the window invited me to come in. Having no other choice, I knocked on the door. No one answered, but the door was unlocked. I pushed it open, and it creaked open, revealing a stuffy, dusty space. A wooden table stood in the middle of the room, with candles that had almost burned out. On the walls, old paintings hung crookedly, all of them portraits of a woman, her with red eyes and that ghostly smile. I turned to leave, but something else on the table caught my eye. An old leather notebook, its cover worn, with the words "Curse of Selene" emblazoned across the outside. I picked up the book and opened it with trembling hands. The pages were old and written in a language I didn't understand, but the drawings were clear. She, Selene, was a witch. She was forced to wander these woods, cursed to hunt the souls of those who strayed. There was one page that froze me, an image of a stone bridge, a river, and a man running away. Exactly what I had just experienced. Just then, a noise came from behind. I turned around, and my heart stopped. She was standing in the doorway, her eyes burning, her crooked smile more evident than ever. Not knowing where I got the courage from, I grabbed the notebook and rushed out the window. Broken glass fell all over me, cutting my skin, but I didn't stop. She chased after me, and this time her growl sounded like the screams of 100 tortured souls. I ran, my legs as if they had lost all feeling, only fear guiding me. As the moonlight faded, I found myself standing before the stone bridge once more. The river flowed beneath me, black as an abyss. She appeared behind me, unhurried, as if knowing that I had no way to escape. Selene spoke, not in words, but in a whisper that echoed in my head. "You cannot escape. You are mine." I had no choice. I took the book in my hand and opened it to the last page. There was a spell written in a strange language, but I felt like I understood it, like someone was guiding me. As I chanted the incantation aloud, Selene screamed, her scream echoing throughout the forest. She charged towards me, but before she could reach me, her body dissolved into black smoke, absorbed into the book in my hand. The book was hot, burning my hand, but I didn't let go. When the smoke cleared, the book was empty, only a blank page remained. I threw it into the river, watching it sink into the dark water. The sun was starting to rise, the first rays of light filtering through the trees. I sat on the ground, my body exhausted, but my mind still haunted by the question, was she really gone? And in that moment, I heard a soft, distant laugh, echoing through the trees. I have always believed in science and reason, and dismissed ghost stories as a way for people to make sense of what they could not understand. But what happened to me last month changed all that. Now, I am not sure I will live long enough to find out. It all started out normal, with no hint of the disaster that was about to strike. My grandmother passed away last month, leaving behind an old house full of stuff. My mother asked me to help her sort through the things she wanted to keep, and that's how I found the album in the attic. The attic was like a graveyard of memories. The air was thick with the smell of rotting wood, and dust clung to old trunks, cardboard boxes, and a gramophone that hadn't played music in decades. The dim light from a hanging bulb did little to dispel the darkness in the corners. I found the album buried under a pile of moldy quilts, the leather cover cracked as if it had been there for centuries. When I opened it, I saw familiar black and white photos, family photos, children playing, solemn faces of adults. I paid no attention until I saw that one. It captured a group of children sitting on the grass in a semicircle, their faces dirty but still radiant. However, what chilled me was not the children, but the man standing behind them. His silhouette was almost lost in the trees behind him, but his smile was unmistakable. That is not a human smile. His mouth was too wide, the corners stretched as if someone had taken a knife to it to create an endless smile. His eyes, bright, cold as broken glass, stared at the camera, at me, as if he knew that one day I would see this picture. I took the photo downstairs and showed it to my mother, hoping for some explanation. But she just shrugged and said it was probably a friend or neighbor she couldn't remember. "Does he look familiar to me?" my mother asked. I shook my head. No, I didn't know him. But deep down, I felt like he knew me very well. That night, the image of the man with the creepy smile haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those sharp eyes, those eyes that seemed to want to swallow me whole. I tried to convince myself that it was just an old photo, that everything could be explained. But I was wrong. 3 days later, I saw him. It was late one evening, as I was walking home after work. The street was quiet, only the dim light of the street lamps fell on the road. I had my headphones on, my head bowed, trying to shake off the fatigue. As I turned a corner, I saw him. He stood under the lamppost, motionless. His mouth still held the same crooked smile, and his eyes were as bright as in the photograph. My heart pounded, and I turned and walked quickly across the street, not daring to look back. I tried to convince myself that it was just some harasser, but deep down, I knew this was not normal. That night, I dreamed of him. In my dream, I went back to my grandmother's attic and opened the album again. All the photos had changed. In each one, he appeared, his smile growing wider, his eyes brighter, until he was the only thing I could see. I woke up with a start, covered in cold sweat, but the feeling of terror did not leave me. In the days that followed, I began to see him everywhere. In the crowds at the subway station, he stood motionless in the middle of the flow of people, his eyes following me. In the mirrors of the windows of buildings, he smiled at me even though when I turned around, he was not there. One night, driving home, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, his smile shining in the headlights. I swerved to avoid him, almost hitting a tree. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, he was gone. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard a faint laugh, as if from far away. My friends started to worry about me looking so haggard. I told my best friend Sarah, but she just thought I was stressed and needed to rest. "Go away for a while," she said. "Get away and relax. You'll feel better." I wanted to believe her, so I booked a cabin in the remote mountains, telling no one where I was going. I hoped the distance would cut off my connection with him, but I was wrong. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any major roads or human traces. It was the perfect place to escape. I hoped that this absolute isolation would bring back the sense of peace I had been missing. The first night passed quietly. I sat by the fire, trying to convince myself that it was all my imagination. The second night, I felt lighter. I began to believe that Sarah might be right, that perhaps I had created my own fears. But on the third night, everything changed. I awoke in the middle of the night to a soft but disturbing sound, a giggle, echoing through the wooden walls of the cabin. It was so small, almost inaudible, but it still sent my senses into alert. I didn't dare move, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind coming through the cracks in the door. But the laughter grew louder, more resonant and clear, as if it were crawling into my ears from all directions. I grabbed the kitchen knife I always kept under my pillow and headed for the window. As I pulled the curtain back, I almost dropped the knife. There he was, standing in the open space just outside the cabin. The pale moonlight illuminated his face, a grin so wide it nearly split his head in two. His eyes were bright, catching the light like broken glass, and they were staring straight at me. I don't know where I got the courage, but I rushed out the door, screaming in anger and panic. "Leave me alone." He didn't answer, didn't move, just looked at me and smiled. As I got closer, his face began to change. His features distorted, his eyes widened, and his smile, it widened so much that the corners of his mouth touched his ears. And then he turned into me. It was an indescribable moment. My breath caught, my mind reeling as I saw myself standing there, but not me. Those eyes, that smile, all of it was exactly like his, but now they were on my face. The entity said nothing. It just looked at me, smiled, and slowly raised its hand, pointing at me. I stepped back, fell to the ground, and when I looked up, it was gone. The next morning, I left the cabin with nothing to pack, just myself and the fear that weighed heavily on my chest. I thought I had escaped, but I was wrong. When I got home, I began to notice changes. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw something wrong. At first it was small details. The corners of my mouth turned up a little higher than usual. My eyes became colder. But then it became clearer. That smile, the smile I had tried so hard to forget, was now on my face. Every day, it grew a little wider until it was painful. I tried not to look in the mirror, but it didn't help. I could feel the change even without seeing it. Friends and colleagues began to avoid me, their eyes filled with fear whenever we interacted. My eyes weren't mine anymore either. They were brighter, almost glowing pale, and every time I looked into them, it felt like I was looking into his eyes, or mine, some other entity I couldn't control. The laughter was no longer an illusion. I heard it every night, closer, clearer. It no longer echoed off the walls, but from within my own mind. I didn't know who I was anymore. I felt like I was fading away, pieces of my soul being ripped away and replaced by something else. That smile wasn't just mine, it was becoming me. If you read this, believe that everything is real. If you see me, stay away. And if you see anyone, anything, with that smile, don't look. Don't answer. And no matter what happens, never smile back. Rudy was the first chocolate terrier our family ever had. I remember his eyes, big, bright, and full of joy. His red collar was a constant reminder of his vibrancy. Even though he was old, Rudy was still full of life, running around the vast grounds surrounding our house in a remote rural area that no one would bother to put on a map. I was home alone that day, both my parents at work. I threw the frozen pizza in the oven, then let Rudy out as usual. Rudy was always allowed to run free. He was trained never to stray too far. But this day was different. I sat on the porch, staring at my phone, completely distracted. I hadn't even noticed that the sun had begun to set, its orange glow casting a bleak shadow over everything. When I smelled something burning, I jumped up and ran into the house, Rudy forgotten. The pizza was charred, and I cursed, frantically trying to hide my failure from my parents. That's when I heard the most horrible sound of my life. The screech of tires on the road and a painful, mournful cry echoed in the evening air. I don't remember how fast I ran into the street, but the image of Rudy lying there is forever seared into my mind. He lay still in the middle of the gravel road, his chest and stomach crushed, blood pooling on the ground. The car was gone, leaving tire tracks on Rudy's body. His eyes that had once been so bright with life, were now dark, devoid of any light. I fell to my knees, sobbing, feeling like everything inside me was collapsing. Rudy had never been out before. I didn't know why he did that. If I hadn't been distracted by that stupid pizza, I might have called him in. I didn't say it, but I knew it was my fault. My parents cried a lot when they found out. We buried Rudy deep in the woods near our house, in a quiet place, away from the eyes of everyone. Even so, I know they blamed me in their hearts. I blamed myself too. The following nights, I often dreamed of Rudy, but it was not the same. In my dreams, Rudy stood far away, his eyes sad, as if blaming me for letting him die. A week later, things started to get strange. That day, I was walking around the yard, talking to my classmates on the phone while breathing in the cool evening air. A gentle breeze blew past, ruffling my hair, but instead of feeling comfortable, I felt a chill down my spine. It felt like someone or something was watching me from the shadows. I turned, my eyes falling on the long, curving path that led to the street. Tall trees lined the sides, casting shadows across the gravel road. Beneath the trees, just a few feet away from me, was a familiar figure, Rudy. But not the Rudy I know. Its body was covered in blood, its fur covered in mud. Its stomach was torn open, revealing its hanging intestines. Its eyes, once gentle and loving, were now deep dark holes, staring at me. It stood still as a statue, not moving, not making a sound. My breath caught, and I almost dropped the phone. When my friend asked what was wrong, her voice was like distant noise. I didn't answer. I couldn't take my eyes off the horrible image before me. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was just imagining things. But when I opened them, Rudy was gone. I returned the call, my voice shaking as I tried to pretend nothing had happened. I talked for a few more minutes, and then hurried home, trying to convince myself that it was just a hallucination, a product of guilt and the flickering darkness of dusk. But I know that's not true. In the days after I first saw Rudy, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every morning, I walked down the gravel road to catch the bus to school. It was a short walk, but every step felt like a journey of fear. On both sides of the road, tall trees cast shadows across the road. Normally, I would hear birds chirping or squirrels running, but now everything was suffocatingly silent. Every time I looked towards the forest, I felt like a pair of eyes were watching me from the darkness. That morning, as I approached the bus stop, I saw Rudy again. He was standing in the middle of the road, near the spot where he had died. His body was still rotting, bloody fur, exposed intestines, and empty eyes. But this time, it's closer. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. Rudy stared at me, unmoving. No sound came out, but I could feel the hatred in his eyes, as if he were blaming me for his death. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen in place. Just as I felt like I was about to faint, the screeching sound of the school bus rang out, breaking the gloomy atmosphere. Rudy disappeared. I rushed onto the bus, my heart pounding. A few of my friends teased me for looking so panicked, but I didn't care. I couldn't get Rudy out of my head. Things got worse at night. Scratching and whining began coming from our front door. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a stray dog. But the sounds weren't like normal dog noises. They were too hoarse, too muffled, like they were coming from something not of this world. I lay in bed, pulled the covers over my head, and tried to cover my ears so I wouldn't have to listen. But the sound still seeped in, making my skin crawl. Then one night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up and ran out of the room, grabbing a flashlight. My parents were sound asleep upstairs, and my father's snoring echoed throughout the house. As I approached the front door, the scratching stopped. My heart was pounding, and I wondered if I should open the door. I turned on my flashlight and peered through the crack in the window next to me. And I saw Rudy. It stood in the doorway, its face almost pressed against the glass. Its eyes were sunken, its ears drooped, and its gray tongue hung to one side. Its dislocated jaw forced its mouth open in a horrifying grin. I screamed, ran back to my room, locked the door, and pulled the covers over my head. I couldn't sleep all night, just lay there shivering, waiting for the light of day. The next day, I told my parents. But instead of believing me, they thought I was stressed. "You're just imagining things, Dylan," Mom said. "You haven't been getting enough sleep, and it's making you think." Dad didn't even look at me, just muttered that I should watch less horror movies. I wanted to scream that they were wrong, but I couldn't find a way to convince them. They didn't see Rudy. They didn't sense its presence. But I know. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard an unusual noise coming from downstairs. It wasn't scratching this time, but footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving around the house. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps got closer, slow but steady. Then, my room door shook slightly, as if someone was standing outside. I cowered, not daring to move. The door did not open, but I felt a presence there. The next morning, I found deep scratches on my door. Things came to a head one morning on the bus when a classmate told her they had seen Rudy. He was standing at the end of the aisle, right before the bus came, she said. "I thought someone was trying to scare us." "Someone put the body out," another voice called out. I felt the blood rush to my face. No one else knew about Rudy's death, and certainly no one was crazy enough to dig him up. I couldn't sit still. As soon as the bus stopped at school, I called my mom and said something was wrong. My parents called the police, and what they found was something I will never forget. The police came to our house that afternoon when my mother reported that someone suspicious had dug up Rudy's grave. One of the officers was a family friend, and he was serious but reassuring. "We'll check the whole area," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "It shouldn't be anything. Probably just wild animals or some stupid prank by kids. But deep down, I know it's not." We led the police to the woods where Rudy had been buried. When we got there, the sight shocked everyone. Rudy's grave had been dug up, the soil was fresh, and the wooden box in which we had buried Rudy was empty. "No animal could do this," an officer muttered, bending down to inspect. My mother turned pale, and my father gritted his teeth, trying to hide his anger. The police searched the area and quickly discovered a small path leading deeper into the woods. We followed them, my heart pounding as the trees grew denser and denser, creating an oppressive darkness. Finally, we came to an old house, deep in the woods, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The house was dilapidated, its walls covered in moss and crisscrossed with cracks. But the most frightening thing was the smell, a musty smell mixed with the smell of decay that made me instantly nauseous. "There's definitely someone here," an officer said, pulling out a flashlight and motioning for us to stop. The police entered the house while my family waited outside. A moment later, a scream came from inside. Another officer rushed in, and a few minutes later, they returned with pale faces. "We found something in the cellar," he said, his voice shaking. "You better not go in." Still, I couldn't help myself. Peering through the open door into the dark basement, I saw an old workbench and another table in the middle of the room. On them lay Rudy's body, but it was not intact. Its body was clumsily sewn together, stuffed with fur, but some parts still showed gruesome wounds. An officer stepped out of the shadows, carrying an old notebook. "We think someone has been here and is behaving unusually," he said. "Not only did he dig up your dog, he used it as part of some kind of haunting." The notebook contained scribbled notes, along with drawings of Rudy and me. Things became clearer when the police found the man who had been living in the abandoned house. He was hiding in another abandoned house across the street from us. He was a thin, middle-aged man with wild eyes and a crooked, unnatural smile, almost like how I imagined Rudy would look when he was haunted. When he was arrested, he laughed and told the story as if it were a harmless joke. He confessed that he had been following my family since before Rudy died, and that he was the one who deliberately lured Rudy out onto the street with dog food and ran him over. "I just wanted to see how he would react," he said, his eyes shining. He lived in the shadows, watching us, and using Rudy's body to mentally torture me. He even imitated the moaning and scratching at the door every night, creating the illusion that Rudy was coming back. When the police took him away, I did not feel relieved. The mental scars he left behind would never fade. My family decided to move away from this house filled with horrible memories. Rudy was buried again, this time in a proper pet cemetery. I often visit him, put a small treat on his grave, and tell myself that he is truly at peace. But every night, I still can't forget Rudy's eyes, or rather, the eyes that the madman made on his body. And sometimes in the dark, I think I still hear scratching at the door. We moved out just 2 weeks after the police arrested that crazy man. Our new house was farther away from the old woods, a smaller house, but enough for us to start over. My parents tried to make a normal life, but I knew they were still haunted by what had happened. Even though I had left that place, I could not escape the darkness of Rudy, or rather the darkness that the madman had created. Every night, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the scratching at the door, the faint moaning that seemed to come from another world. It was just my imagination, I told myself. It's over, but deep down, I don't believe it. A month after moving in, everything seemed to be back to normal. I went to school, did my homework, and tried to forget what had happened. But then, strange things started to happen. One morning I woke up to find dirty paw prints all over my front door. A dog's, big and deep, as if it had been standing there all night. My parents assumed it was some stray dog, but I knew it wasn't. The footprints seemed strangely familiar, and they led straight to my bedroom window. The dreams of Rudy became more frequent. In the dream, I found myself standing in the old woods, the abandoned house looming before me. Rudy stood there, his eyes empty and his body rotting. But this time, he didn't stand still. He walked toward me, step by step, his mouth wide open, revealing sharp teeth. I often woke up with a start, drenched in cold sweat, and with a pounding heart. But the scariest thing wasn't the dream. It was the feeling of being watched even when I was awake. One night, I lay in bed, trying not to think about the dream and the footprints. But then I heard it, scratching at the door. At first it was gentle, as if someone was just testing the waters. But after a few minutes, the scratching became louder and more urgent. I froze, not daring to move. This time, I knew I couldn't hide forever. I had to face whatever was waiting outside. Taking a flashlight and a kitchen knife, I opened the door. There was no one there. But on the doorstep, there was a red necklace, Rudy's necklace. I brought the necklace into the house, filled with fear. My parents didn't understand why I was so obsessed with it, but I couldn't convince them that what I was experiencing was real. That madman was caught, but I feel like he's still watching me, even if only in my dreams. The police had assured me that he was no longer a threat, but I couldn't shake the thought that he had left a part of himself, or a part of Rudy, with me. One night, I decided to break the cycle. I took the necklace out into the woods near my house, where there was a small lake. I stood at the edge of the water, the necklace in my hand, feeling the coldness penetrate my skin. "I'm sorry, Rudy," I whispered. "I can't change what happened, but I hope you can rest in peace." I threw the necklace into the water and watched it sink. But as soon as it hit bottom, I heard barking. I turned back, and there stood Rudy, his body rotting, his eyes empty, but this time, he didn't look at me with hatred. It just stood there, looking at me one last time, before turning and disappearing into the darkness of the forest. Since that night, the scratching at the door has stopped. The dreams about Rudy have gradually faded away. I don't know if Rudy has ever truly forgiven me, but I hope he has found peace. Still, sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind blew through the window, I would hear quiet footsteps on the porch. And for a brief moment, I felt as if Rudy was still watching me, no longer as a vengeful ghost, but as a loyal friend, protecting me from afar.